Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is David Jones, and I am 31 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Hollow Ridge, Pennsylvania, deep in the heart of the Allegheny National Forest, where the ancient trees grow so thick that daylight barely penetrates even at noon. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, my college roommate Marcus Williams, and our mutual friend Sarah Rodriguez. We'd been planning it for months, ever since Sarah's divorce was finalized and she needed to get away from everything. Marcus had found this spot on some obscure hiking forum, a place called Hollow Ridge that supposedly offered incredible views and complete isolation from the modern world. No cell towers for 30 miles, he'd said with that characteristic grin of his, the one that usually preceded his worst ideas. Just us, nature, and some good old-fashioned camping. Sarah had been enthusiastic about the idea. She was going through what she called her wilderness phase, buying expensive hiking boots and a sleeping bag rated for Arctic conditions. After 18 months of a bitter divorce battle, I couldn't blame her for wanting to disappear into the woods for a while. We left Pittsburgh early Friday morning in Marcus's battered Jeep Cherokee, driving northwest through increasingly rural Pennsylvania until the highways became state routes, then county roads, then unmarked dirt tracks that seemed to lead nowhere. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and Marcus was navigating with a paper map he'd printed from some survivalist website. "Are you sure you know where we're going?" Sarah asked from the passenger seat, her voice carrying just a hint of anxiety as we bounced along a rutted logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. "Relax," Marcus said, though I noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The forum said to look for the old ranger station with the broken windows. Should be coming up any minute now. The ranger station, when we finally found it, was more ruins than building. Weather-beaten walls leaned at impossible angles, and windows stared out like dead eyes. Graffiti covered what remained of the front door, but it wasn't the usual teenage tags. These were symbols I didn't recognize, angular, primitive shapes that seemed to writhe when I looked at them too long. "Cheerful," Sarah muttered, but she was already checking her pack, eager to start hiking. According to Marcus's printout, the trail to Hollow Ridge began behind the station and wound 4 miles through dense forest to a clearing where we could set up camp. The hike started pleasant enough. The October air was crisp, filled with the earthy smell of decomposing leaves, and the forest was alive with the subtle sounds of small animals moving through the underbrush. But as we climbed higher, something began to feel wrong. It started with the silence. At first, I thought it was just the natural quiet of deep woods, but then I realized it was more than that. There were no bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustling of small creatures in the leaves. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing sound. "Is it just me, or is it really quiet up here?" Sarah asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Marcus paused on the trail ahead of us, cocking his head to listen. "Yeah, it is weird. Maybe there's a predator around? Sometimes that makes everything go quiet." We kept hiking, but the oppressive silence followed us like a living thing. The trees seemed to press closer together, their branches intertwining overhead until only scattered fragments of sky were visible. The trail became harder to follow, sometimes disappearing entirely into carpets of fallen leaves or branching off in multiple directions with no markers to guide us. "Are we lost?" Sarah asked when we stopped at yet another unmarked fork in the path. Marcus consulted his map, frowning. "I don't think so. The trail should be straightforward. Maybe we took a wrong turn back there." But when we looked back, there was no clear trail behind us either. The forest seemed to have swallowed our route, leaving only shadowy gaps between the trees that all looked identical. "This is impossible," I said, fighting down a rising sense of panic. "We've only been hiking for 2 hours. We can't be this lost." That's when we heard it, a low, mournful sound drifting through the trees. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. It rose and fell like a lament, echoing off the tree trunks until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered. The sound came again, closer this time, and underneath it I could swear I heard something else, a rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming against bark. "We need to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice tight with tension. "Find the ridge. Set up camp before dark." We pushed forward, following what seemed like the most worn path, though even that was debatable. The tapping sound followed us, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, never quite close enough to identify but never far enough away to ignore. The mournful wailing continued too, rising and falling in patterns that almost seemed like communication. By the time we reached what Marcus insisted was Hollow Ridge, the sun was already setting behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The ridge was little more than a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, but it was flat enough for our tents and had a circle of stones that previous campers had used for a fire pit. "Finally," Sarah said, dropping her pack with obvious relief. "Let's get camp set up before it gets completely dark." We worked quickly in the fading light, setting up our two-person tents and gathering firewood from the edge of the clearing. The sounds had stopped during our final push to the ridge, but the silence felt even more ominous than the mysterious noises. Marcus had just gotten a fire started when we heard the first scream. It came from the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight. A human scream. Definitely human, but distorted somehow, as if the vocal cords producing it weren't quite the right shape. It was full of pain and terror and something else, something that made my skin crawl and my primitive brain scream warnings. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered, instinctively moving closer to the fire. "Was that a person?" The scream came again, and this time I could tell it was coming from multiple directions. Not echoes, multiple sources, as if whatever was making that sound was surrounding us. Should we go help?" Sarah asked, though her voice made it clear she really didn't want to. "Help what?" Marcus snapped, his usual easy confidence nowhere to be found. That didn't sound like someone who needed help. That sounded like someone who was way past help. The screaming continued for nearly an hour, sometimes close, sometimes distant, sometimes seeming to come from directly above us in the canopy. We huddled around our fire, feeding it constantly to keep the flames high, and tried to convince ourselves that there was a rational explanation. Coyotes, maybe. Or some kind of bird. But we all knew better. When the screaming finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse. We sat around the fire, jumping at every small sound, every crackle of burning wood, every whisper of wind through the branches. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah said finally. "Pack up and hike back to the car." "In the dark?" Marcus shook his head. "Through those woods? With whatever that was out there? No way. We're safer here with the fire." He was probably right, but as the night wore on, I began to question that assumption. The fire seemed to be attracting attention rather than providing protection. I kept seeing shapes moving just beyond the circle of light, tall, thin figures that stood among the trees, watching us. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Marcus, pointing toward a particularly large pine where I was sure I'd seen something tall and pale. He followed my gaze and nodded slowly. "Yeah, I see it." "See what?" Sarah demanded, looking where we were pointing. "Nothing," Marcus said quickly, "just shadows." But it wasn't nothing. As the fire burned lower despite our constant feeding, the shapes became more distinct. They were human-like but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, moving in ways that hurt to watch, and they were getting closer. Around midnight, Sarah announced she was going to her tent to try to get some sleep. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked. "I can't stay awake all night," she said. "Besides, whatever's out there, it would have attacked by now if it was going to." Marcus and I stayed by the fire, taking turns adding wood and watching the tree line. The shapes continued their slow circling, never quite stepping into the light but never disappearing entirely either. "This is fucked up," Marcus muttered. "I've been camping my whole life and I've never experienced anything like this." "Maybe it's just our imagination," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Fear and darkness playing tricks on us. Both of us having the same hallucination? I didn't have an answer for that. Around 3 in the morning, Sarah screamed. It wasn't the inhuman wailing we'd heard earlier. This was definitely Sarah, and she was terrified. Marcus and I both grabbed flashlights and ran toward her tent, but when we unzipped the door, it was empty. Her sleeping bag was there, unzipped from the inside. Her boots were still neatly placed beside her pack, but Sarah was gone. "Sarah," Marcus called into the darkness. "Sarah, where are you?" No response. We spent the next hour searching the perimeter of the clearing, calling her name and sweeping our flashlight beams through the trees. But the forest seemed to swallow our voices, and our lights penetrated only a few feet into the oppressive darkness. "We have to go find her," Marcus said when we finally stopped to catch our breath. "Go where?" I demanded. "We don't even know which direction she went. And what if whatever took her is still out there?" "So we just abandon her." Before I could answer, we heard her voice calling from the darkness. "Marcus, David, help me." The voice was definitely Sarah's, but something about it seemed off. The cadence was wrong, like someone reading from a script in a language they didn't quite understand. "Sarah," Marcus called back, "where are you?" "I'm lost," came the reply. "I got turned around. I can see your fire, but I can't find my way back." Marcus was already grabbing his flashlight, but I caught his arm. "Wait," I said. "Something's wrong." "What do you mean?" "Listen to her voice. It doesn't sound right." Marcus paused, and we both strained to hear. Sarah called out again, and this time I was certain. The voice was too flat, too emotionless for someone who was genuinely lost and frightened. "Sarah," Marcus called carefully. "What's your middle name?" A long pause. Then, "Help me, I can see your fire." The same words, in the same flat tone, as if whatever was mimicking her voice had a limited vocabulary. "That's not Sarah," I whispered. As if in response to my words, the voice began calling from multiple directions at once. Always the same phrases. "Help me. I'm lost. I can see your fire." But now there were dozens of voices, all with Sarah's timbre but lacking any trace of her personality. We retreated to our fire, which had burned dangerously low while we were searching. As we fed it fresh wood, the flames revealed something that made my blood freeze. Sarah was standing at the edge of the clearing. She looked exactly like herself. Same clothes, same hair, same face, but she was standing perfectly still, arms at her sides, staring at us with an expression of complete emptiness. Her eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Sarah?" Marcus called tentatively. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. "Sarah, are you okay?" Very slowly, she began to smile. But it wasn't Sarah's smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth, and it never reached her eyes. "I'm fine," she said in that same flat tone. "Come here." "No," I said, grabbing Marcus's arm as he started to step toward her. "That's not her." The thing wearing Sarah's face tilted its head like a curious bird. "Come here," it repeated. When we didn't move, it began walking toward us. Its gait was wrong. Too smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. As it drew closer, I could see that its eyes were completely black, reflecting the firelight like pools of oil. "Come here," it said again, and this time its voice was layered, as if multiple people were speaking the words simultaneously. Marcus raised his flashlight and shone it directly at the thing's face. In the harsh white light, its features seemed to shift and blur, as if we were looking at it through water. The smile never wavered. "What do you want?" Marcus demanded. The thing stopped just outside the circle of firelight. "Come here," it said in Sarah's voice. Then, in a voice that was deeper, more guttural, "Come to us." "Where's Sarah?" I shouted. "What did you do with her?" The thing's head tilted the other way. When it spoke again, it was in Sarah's voice, but the words were wrong. "David, Marcus, I'm so cold. Please help me. I can't find my way home." "Prove you're Sarah," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "Tell us something only Sarah would know." The thing stood silent for a long moment, its black eyes fixed on us. Then it began to speak in a voice that was Sarah's, but somehow came from everywhere at once. "I remember when you kissed me at Jenny's party, Marcus. I remember how you told me you loved me, David. I remember all your secrets, all your fears. I know how you cried when your father died, Marcus. I know how you wake up screaming from nightmares about the car accident, David." It was using our memories, but twisting them. Sarah had never kissed Marcus at any party. I'd never told her about my nightmares. But somehow, this thing knew details about our lives that we'd never shared with anyone. "Come here," it said again, and began moving toward us once more. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it up like a weapon. The thing stopped, its empty eyes fixed on the flames. "It doesn't like fire," I whispered to Marcus. The thing that looked like Sarah began to laugh, a sound like glass breaking, harsh and wrong. As it laughed, its face began to change. The features remained Sarah's, but they started to elongate, the mouth stretching too wide, the eyes sinking deeper into the skull. "Fire burns," it said in a voice that was no longer even pretending to be human. "But cold is eternal." The temperature around us began to drop rapidly. Our breath started coming out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the nearby trees. The fire, which had been burning strongly moments before, began to sputter and dim. "Feed the fire!" I shouted to Marcus, but when he threw more wood on, the flames barely responded. It was as if the heat was being sucked away faster than we could produce it. The thing wearing Sarah's face had stopped laughing and was now approaching again, its features continuing to distort. Its limbs were becoming too long, its fingers stretching into claw-like appendages. "This is our place," it said in voices that seemed to come from the forest itself. "You do not belong here, but we will make you belong. We will make you stay." I could see other shapes emerging from the tree line now, tall, impossible figures that moved like broken marionettes. They all had human faces, but wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to recreate human features from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. "Run," I whispered to Marcus. "Where?" It was a good question. We were surrounded and we had no idea which direction would lead us back to the car. But staying meant facing whatever these things planned to do to us. The Sarah thing was close enough now that I could smell it. A rotten, fetid odor like decomposing leaves and stagnant water. When it spoke again, its voice was a chorus of whispers. She fought so hard, screamed so prettily, but in the end, she came to us willingly. They always do. That's when I saw it. Hanging from one of the Sarah thing's elongated fingers was a strip of fabric. Sarah's jacket, torn and bloody. The rage that filled me was pure and primal. Without thinking, I swung the burning branch at the thing's face. It connected with a sound like sizzling meat, and the creature shrieked, not in Sarah's voice anymore, but in something that might have been the sound wind makes through dead trees. "Run!" I shouted, and Marcus and I bolted into the forest. We crashed through the underbrush, our flashlight beams dancing wildly as we tried to navigate between the trees. Behind us, I could hear sounds of pursuit. Not footsteps, but something more like rustling, as if the forest itself was moving to follow us. "The trail!" Marcus gasped. "We need to find the trail!" But in the darkness, every direction looked the same. The trees seemed to shift and move when we weren't looking directly at them, and our flashlights revealed paths that hadn't been there moments before. We ran for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time seemed elastic in the darkness, stretching and contracting without pattern. Every few minutes we would hear Sarah's voice calling to us from the darkness. "David, Marcus, why did you leave me? I'm hurt. Please come back." But we knew better now. Whatever was using her voice was hunting us. trying to lure us back into its trap. Eventually, exhaustion forced us to stop. We huddled together behind a fallen log, trying to catch our breath and orient ourselves. Our flashlights were starting to dim, and we had no idea which direction we'd been running. "We're completely lost," Marcus whispered. "Maybe when the sun comes up, we can get our bearings," I said, though the thought of spending hours in these woods filled me with dread. That's when we heard it, an engine. It was distant, but unmistakable, the sound of a vehicle moving along a road. We looked at each other with sudden hope. "The logging road," Marcus said. "We must be close to where we parked." We followed the sound, stumbling through the darkness toward what we hoped was salvation. The engine noise grew louder, and eventually we saw lights through the trees, the headlights of a truck moving slowly along the dirt road. We burst out of the forest just as the truck was passing our position. I had never been so happy to see another human being in my life. The truck stopped and an older man got out, a local, judging by his flannel shirt and worn jeans. He looked us over with the kind of practiced eye that suggested he'd seen lost hikers before. "You boys okay?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "We need to get out of here," I said. Something happened to our friend." The man's expression grew serious. "Where?" "Up at Hollow Ridge. We were camping and something took her." The man was quiet for a long moment, studying our faces in the truck's headlights. Finally, he nodded toward his vehicle. "Get in. I'll take you to the ranger station. They'll know what to do." As we climbed into the truck, I looked back at the forest. The trees seemed to be moving in the darkness, and I could swear I saw pale figures standing among them, watching us leave. "Does this happen often?" Marcus asked the driver as we pulled away. The old man was quiet for so long that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, just as we reached the main road, he spoke. "Hollow Ridge has been trouble for as long as anyone can remember. Used to be a Seneca burial ground, before the logging companies moved in. Some places, the dead don't rest easy." "What about the things we saw? The creatures?" Another long pause. "Every few years, someone goes missing up there. Usually hikers or campers who don't know the stories. Sometimes they find the bodies. Sometimes they don't." "And the authorities know about this?" The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Son, the authorities around here know better than to go up to Hollow Ridge after dark. They'll file a report, but they won't mount a search until daylight. And by then." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. At the ranger station, we gave our statements to a tired-looking deputy who took notes but didn't seem particularly surprised by our story. He promised they would organize a search party at first light, but his tone suggested he didn't expect to find Sarah alive. Marcus and I drove back to Pittsburgh in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find logical explanations for what we'd experienced. Hallucinations brought on by stress and fear, perhaps. Or elaborate pranks by locals who wanted to keep outsiders away from their hunting grounds. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what had worn Sarah's face and spoken with her voice. And I knew that somewhere in those dark woods, something unnatural had claimed another victim. The official search lasted 3 days and found no trace of Sarah Rodriguez. The case was eventually filed as a missing person, with the assumption that she had gotten lost in the woods and succumbed to exposure or injury. Her body was never found. Marcus and I never spoke about what really happened that night. How could we? Who would believe us? But sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I hear Sarah's voice calling to me. Not the flat, emotionless mimicry of the thing that took her, but her real voice, full of pain and fear. "David," it whispers, "why did you leave me? Why didn't you save me?" And I know that somewhere in the darkness of Hollow Ridge, Sarah Rodriguez is still screaming, still fighting against things that should not exist in any sane world, still waiting for someone to come back for her. But I also know that anyone who tries will join her in that endless, frozen hell. The rational part of my mind tells me to let the dead rest. But the part of me that loved Sarah as a friend, that promised to protect her on this trip, that part whispers that I should go back, that I should face whatever lurks in those woods and try to bring her home. It's been 6 months since that night, and I still wake up screaming. I've moved 3 times, changed my phone number twice, and started sleeping with all the lights on. But I can't escape the knowledge that somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, ancient things are stirring. Things that hunger for human warmth and human memories, things that wear the faces of our loved ones while they feed on our terror. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I think about driving back to Hollow Ridge, not to camp or hike, but to face what took Sarah and either rescue her or join her. Because the worst part isn't wondering what happened to her. The worst part is knowing that whatever those things did to her, she's probably still alive to experience it. And that knowledge is slowly driving me insane. My name is James Anderson, and I am 22 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pine Creek Gorge, Pennsylvania, during what was supposed to be our last adventure together before graduation. The 5 of us had been planning this trip for months. Michael Williams, our self-appointed leader with his military surplus gear and overconfidence, had insisted we tackle the most isolated section of Pine Creek Gorge. Real wilderness, he'd called it, spreading topographic maps across his dorm room floor like a general planning a campaign. No cell towers, no park rangers, no safety nets, just us and the wild. Sarah Rodriguez had rolled her eyes at his machismo, but even she couldn't hide her excitement at the prospect of genuine solitude. Kevin King just grinned and made jokes about bears and Bigfoot, while Emily Hall quietly researched the area's history on her laptop, her face growing more troubled with each article she read. I should have paid more attention to what Emily found. I should have listened when she started talking about the local legends, the warnings buried in century-old newspaper clippings and historical society records. But I was young and arrogant, convinced that bad things only happened to other people who weren't as careful or prepared as we were. We drove up from Penn State on a Friday afternoon in mid-October, the trees already bleeding brilliant red and gold against the gray October sky. The last real town we passed was Jersey Shore, population barely 2,000. And after that, the roads grew narrower and more twisted until we were driving on gravel, then dirt. Michael navigated using an old paper map, claiming GPS couldn't be trusted in the backcountry. Our destination was a remote camping area near the West Rim Trail, accessible only by a logging road that hadn't seen maintenance since the Clinton administration. The deeper we drove into the mountains, the more the landscape seemed to change around us. The cheerful autumn colors gave way to darker, more oppressive tones. The trees pressed closer to the road, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight. Even with the windows down, the air felt thick and stagnant, carrying strange scents. Not the clean pine and earth smell you'd expect, but something sweeter and more cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. "Anyone else notice how quiet it's getting?" Sarah asked from the passenger seat, her usual confidence wavering slightly. She was right. As we climbed higher into the gorge, the normal sounds of the forest, birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects humming, had gradually faded until all we could hear was the crunch of our tires on gravel and the low rumble of the engine. Emily leaned forward from the back seat, her laptop balanced on her knees. "I've been reading more about this area. The local Seneca tribe called this region Ontario Keonton, the place where spirits hunger. They considered it forbidden territory, somewhere that should never be entered by the living. Native Americans had taboos about lots of places," Michael said dismissively, but I noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Doesn't mean anything supernatural. Probably just dangerous terrain, maybe sacred burial grounds they wanted to keep private." "Maybe," Emily said quietly, but she kept reading. According to the historical records, there were multiple incidents here between 1840 and 1900, logging camps that went missing entirely, Search parties that found evidence of unnatural behavior. Kevin twisted around to look at her. What kind of unnatural behavior? Emily's face was pale in the laptop's glow. Cannibalism. Multiple documented cases of people consuming human flesh, but always during mild weather when there was no shortage of food or supplies. Almost like something was compelling them to do it. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Emily, maybe save the ghost stories for when we're around the campfire. But she kept reading, her voice growing more strained. The last recorded incident was in 1923. A family of 5 went missing while hiking in this exact area. When searchers found their camp 3 weeks later, they discovered evidence that the family had turned on each other. The youngest victim was only 8 years old. The car hit a particularly deep pothole, jarring us all back to the present. Michael cursed and slowed down, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. The sun was already sinking behind the ridgeline when we finally reached the trailhead. The parking area was just a widened spot in the dirt road, surrounded by towering hemlocks that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no airplanes, no hint of civilization. Even our own voices seemed muffled, as if the forest was absorbing sound itself. "Perfect," Michael declared, shouldering his massive pack with forced enthusiasm. "We'll hike in about 2 miles and make camp near Dead Man's Creek." "Cheerful name," Kevin said, but his usual humor sounded forced in the oppressive quiet. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from the dark spaces between the trees. The trail was well marked at first, following an old railroad grade that had once carried lumber from these forests during the logging boom of the late 1800s. But as we hiked deeper, the path became fainter, more overgrown. Branches seemed to reach across the trail deliberately, forcing us to duck and weave. Emily walked behind me, unusually quiet, checking her compass obsessively every few minutes. "Everything okay?" I asked during one of our rest stops. She bit her lip, her face troubled. "The compass is acting strange. It keeps pointing in different directions, even when we're walking straight. And look at this." She showed me her smartphone. The GPS screen was blank except for an error message. "Location services unavailable." "Mountains can interfere with signals," I said, but even as I spoke, I pulled out my own phone. Same error message. So did everyone else's. "That's impossible," Sarah said, staring at her device. "We're not that remote. GPS should work anywhere." Michael was studying his paper map with a frown. "According to this, we should have reached the creek junction by now, but I don't see any landmarks that match." We pressed on as the daylight faded, our headlamps creating dancing circles of light in the growing darkness. The forest around us seemed to shift and change in the moving beams, shadows taking on shapes that looked almost human before resolving back into innocent tree trunks and rocks. We reached our intended campsite just as full darkness fell. But something was wrong. Dead Man's Creek was aptly named. The water ran black and silent between moss-covered rocks, reflecting nothing even when we shone our lights directly on it. The trees pressed close on all sides, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even with our headlamps the darkness felt solid. Oppressive, almost alive. But it was the smell that really unsettled me. That sweet, cloying odor I'd noticed in the car was stronger here, so thick I could taste it on my tongue. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't place it until Kevin wrinkled his nose and said, "Smells like the meat locker in my uncle's butcher shop when the refrigeration broke down." That's when I realized what we were smelling: rotting flesh. Michael immediately took charge of setting up camp with military precision, perhaps trying to impose order on the increasingly chaotic situation. "James, you and Kevin gather firewood. Sarah, help me with the tents. Emily, get the stove going for dinner." I was grateful for something to do. The silence was getting to me. Not just quiet, but an absence of sound that seemed to swallow our voices. No insects, no owl calls, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Just the whisper of the creek and our own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the dead air. Kevin and I worked efficiently, gathering deadfall from the surrounding forest. But I noticed something odd about the wood we collected. Despite the damp October air and recent rains, every piece was strangely dry, almost brittle. Some of the branches crumbled to dust at our touch, as if they'd been drained of moisture, and the further we went from camp, the stronger that rotting smell became. "You getting a bad feeling about this place?" Kevin asked quietly as we loaded our arms with kindling. His usual joking demeanor had evaporated completely. "Yeah," I admitted. "Maybe we should suggest moving camp tomorrow. Find somewhere more normal." Kevin nodded eagerly. "Good idea. This place gives me the creeps. And did you notice? No animals at all. No bugs, no birds, nothing. It's like everything that lives here moved away." As we headed back to camp, I heard Kevin gasp behind me. I turned to see him staring at something on the ground. In the beam of his headlamp was a pile of bones, yellowed with age but clearly visible against the dark earth. They were scattered in a rough circle, as if whatever had died here had been picked clean where it fell. "Animal bones," I said, but even as I spoke, I recognized the distinctive shape of a human skull among the remains. "Jesus," Kevin whispered. "How many people have died out here?" We returned to camp in silence, both of us shaken. Emily had the camp stove assembled but couldn't get it to light. She clicked the igniter again and again, growing increasingly frustrated. "Here, let me try," Michael said, taking over with his usual confidence. But the stove refused to cooperate, producing only cold, clicking sounds despite the fuel gauge showing a full tank. "Must be the altitude," Sarah suggested, though we were only at about 1,500 feet, hardly enough to affect equipment. "Or maybe something else," Emily said quietly. She was looking at her compass again, and I could see her hands shaking. "North keeps changing direction. It's like the magnetic field here is all wrong." We eventually got a small fire started using the dry wood Kevin and I had gathered, but even that seemed unnatural. The flames were a strange blue-white color instead of the normal orange-red, and they gave off almost no heat despite burning brightly. The light they cast seemed wrong too, creating shadows that moved independently of the flames and making our faces look corpse-pale in the eerie glow. Emily heated canned soup over the fire while we sat on logs arranged in a tight circle, our backs to the oppressive darkness. Every few minutes, one of us would turn to shine a light into the forest, convinced we'd heard movement or seen eyes reflecting in the blackness. But our beams always revealed nothing except more trees, more darkness. That's when Kevin started telling stories, desperate to break the suffocating tension. "So this guy walks into a bar with jumper cables around his neck," he began, his voice overly loud in the oppressive quiet. "The bartender says, 'I'll serve you, but don't start anything.'" We laughed, but the sound died quickly in the thick air, absorbed by the forest before it could travel more than a few feet. Kevin tried another joke, then another, but each one fell flatter than the last. The darkness seemed to be stealing our voices, our laughter, even our will to speak. Finally, Kevin gave up and stared into the fire, uncharacteristically subdued. The blue flames danced hypnotically, casting those strange, moving shadows on the trees around us. "Emily," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "tell us more about those disappearances you researched." Emily looked uncomfortable, glancing nervously at the darkness beyond our small circle of light. "Maybe we shouldn't—" "Come on," Michael insisted, though his usual bravado sounded forced. "We're camping in the middle of nowhere. Might as well get spooked properly." Emily sighed and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with her careful handwriting. The first recorded incident was in 1847, a logging crew of 12 men working this exact section of forest. When supplies didn't arrive that winter due to early snows, they were cut off for 4 months. When the thaw came and people could reach them again, they found the camp abandoned. Signs of struggle, but no bodies. Maybe they just left, I suggested, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. That's what people thought initially, Emily continued, until they found the bones, scattered around the camp in ritualistic patterns, cracked open for marrow. Human bones, confirmed by the territorial coroner. The local Seneca warned people about this area afterward. They called it a place where the Wendigo lived, where men became something else when they ate the flesh of other men. The fire popped loudly, sending sparks into the darkness. We all jumped, our nerves stretched tight as violin strings. Wendigo, Kevin said quietly, his voice barely audible. That's a cannibalistic creature from Algonquian folklore, a human who turned to eating human flesh and became something monstrous. Always hungry, never satisfied. It's just folklore, Sarah said firmly, but I noticed she moved closer to the fire, her eyes constantly scanning the darkness around us. Maybe, Emily said, turning a page in her notebook. But there were more incidents. 1863, a family of fur trappers. 1879, a geological survey team. 1892, 3 hunters from Philadelphia. Always the same pattern, people going missing, evidence of cannibalism, survivors talking about something in the woods that wasn't quite human anymore. She paused, her finger tracing lines of text. The most detailed account comes from 1901. A naturalist named Theodore Blackwood was studying the local ecosystem when he encountered what he described as a creature that had once been a man, but was changed by unspeakable hunger into something far worse. According to his journal, the thing could mimic human voices perfectly, using them to lure victims into the darkness. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp. We all turned toward the sound, our flashlight beams probing the spaces between the trees, but finding nothing except more impenetrable blackness. "Just the wood settling," Michael said, but his hand moved instinctively toward the hunting knife on his belt. "Old trees make noise as they cool down at night." But I wasn't convinced. The sound had been too sharp, too deliberate, like something large stepping on a piece of deadfall, something that knew how to move quietly through the forest but had made that one small mistake. We went to bed shortly after, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the absolute silence outside our tent. No wind, no animals, no insects. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset, and I could see my breath misting in the beam of my headlamp. But it wasn't just cold. There was something else in the air, a presence that made my skin crawl and my muscles tense with primal fear. Sometime during the night, I woke to a strange sound, a rhythmic scratching, like fingernails on bark. I lay perfectly still, listening intently. The sound moved around our campsite in a slow circle, never coming close enough to identify clearly, but never moving far enough away to ignore. It was deliberate, methodical, as if something was studying our camp, learning the layout, planning. The scratching was accompanied by another sound that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Deep, raspy inhalations and exhalations that didn't quite sound human. Too slow, too measured, with an underlying wetness that suggested damaged lungs or throat. I wanted to wake the others, but terror had paralyzed me. I could only lie there listening as whatever was outside our tents continued its patient circling. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded away, moving deeper into the forest. But I didn't sleep again until dawn. In the morning, Kevin was gone. We discovered his absence when Michael called for everyone to get up for breakfast. Kevin's tent was zipped shut from the outside, but when we opened it, his sleeping bag was empty, unzipped from the inside, as if he'd gotten up and left in the middle of the night. The strange thing was, all his gear was still there. Boots, jacket, headlamp, even his wallet and car keys. Who goes hiking in the middle of the night barefoot and underdressed? "He probably just went to take a piss," Sarah said, but her voice was tight with concern. "You know, Kevin. He's always wandering off." We called his name, searched the immediate area around our campsite, checked the creek banks. No sign of him anywhere. The forest seemed to absorb our voices, making our calls disappear just a few yards away. "We need to find him," I said, fighting down a growing panic. He could be hurt, lost, hypothermic. Michael was studying the ground around Kevin's tent with a deep frown. "Look at this." We gathered around where he was kneeling. In the soft earth beside the tent were footprints leading away into the forest. But they weren't quite right. The prints started out human-sized and human-shaped, Kevin's bare feet clearly visible in the dirt. But as they moved away from the tent, they began to change. They grew longer, narrower, with what looked like claw marks extending from the toes. By the time the tracks reached the tree line, they were no longer recognizably human. "What the hell made those?" Sarah whispered, her face pale in the morning light. Emily's face had gone ashen. "Those aren't human tracks, at least not entirely." "They have to be," Michael insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Kevin was goofing around, playing some kind of prank. Maybe he had some kind of fake foot attachments." But even as he said it, we all knew that wasn't true. The transformation in the tracks was too gradual, too organic. And Kevin wasn't the type to plan elaborate practical jokes, especially not ones that involved wandering into the wilderness alone at night. The tracks led straight into the deepest part of the forest, where the undergrowth was so thick it would be nearly impossible to follow. They disappeared into a maze of fallen logs and thorny bushes that looked like it hadn't been disturbed by human passage in decades. "We need to get help," I said, my voice shaking. "Contact the Park Service, local police, search and rescue." Michael pulled out his phone, but we already knew what he'd find. No signal, just like yesterday. We were too deep in the gorge, too far from any cell towers. The GPS still showed nothing but error messages. "The nearest road is 2 miles back the way we came," Sarah said. "Someone should hike out, get help." "And leave the others here alone?" Emily shook her head vigorously. "We stick together. That's the first rule of wilderness safety." We spent the day searching for Kevin, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. But the forest seemed to swallow sound itself, making our calls disappear just a few yards away. The strange tracks continued deeper into the wilderness, but following them would mean leaving the trail entirely and venturing into terrain that grew more treacherous with every step. As we searched, we found other disturbing signs. More bone piles, some clearly human, scattered throughout the forest. Trees with scratch marks too high and too deep to have been made by any local wildlife. And always that smell, that sweet, cloying odor of rotting meat that seemed to grow stronger as we moved deeper into the woods. Most unsettling of all were the voices. Several times throughout the day we heard what sounded like Kevin calling for help from somewhere in the distance. But each time we followed the sound, it led us deeper into the forest, further from the trail, until we'd realize we were being led astray and have to backtrack to avoid getting lost ourselves. "That's not Kevin," Emily said after the third false call. "It sounds like him, but it's not him." "How can you be sure?" Sarah asked. Emily's face was grim. "Because Kevin never called me by my full name. He always called me Em, but that voice keeps calling for Emily to come help him." As the sun began to set, we had to make a decision. Sarah wanted to hike out immediately, get professional help. Michael insisted Kevin would return on his own, that he was probably just lost and would follow the creek back to camp. Emily and I were torn between the two options. "One more night," Michael decided. "If he's not back by morning, we all hike out together and get the authorities involved." That second night was worse than the first. We kept the fire burning bright and stayed close together, afraid to go more than a few feet from the flames. Emily sat pressed against my side, trembling despite the warmth. Every sound made us jump. the pop of the fire, the whisper of wind in the trees, the distant call of what might have been an owl but sounded almost human. The scratching sound returned around midnight, circling our camp again. This time, all of us heard it. We sat in terrified silence as something moved through the darkness beyond our firelight, studying us, learning us, planning something we couldn't begin to imagine. "It's just an animal," Michael whispered, but his hand was gripping his knife so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Animals don't behave like that," Emily replied. "They don't circle camps for hours. They either attack or they leave." The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. We sat frozen, waiting for something to happen, for some sign of what was watching us from the darkness. That's when we heard Kevin calling. "Help!" The voice came from somewhere in the darkness beyond our firelight, weak and desperate. "I'm hurt! I can't find the camp!" We all jumped up, grabbing flashlights and headlamps. After a day of searching and false calls, we were desperate to believe this was really him. "Kevin!" Michael shouted back. "Keep calling. We'll find you." "This way." Kevin's voice seemed to come from the north, toward the deeper forest where the strange tracks had led. "I think I broke my ankle. Please, I'm scared." Michael started toward the sound, but Emily grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "Something's wrong." "He's hurt," Michael protested, trying to pull free. "Listen carefully," Emily insisted. We stood still, straining to hear. Kevin called again, but this time we could tell. Something was off about the voice. It was the right tone, the right words, but there was no emotion behind it. No pain, no fear, no personality. Like someone reading lines from a script without understanding their meaning. "That's not Kevin," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. The calling stopped. The silence stretched out, thick and oppressive. Then, from much closer than before, maybe only 20 feet away, just beyond the edge of our firelight, we heard laughter. Kevin's laugh, but wrong somehow. Too long, too low, with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Kevin?" I called tentatively. "I'm here," came the reply, but the voice seemed to come from all around us at once, echoing off the trees in ways that defied physics. "I'm right here. Found something wonderful in the dark. Movement in the darkness beyond our fire. A figure stepping into the very edge of our light, just barely visible. It was Kevin. Same height, same build, same clothes he'd been wearing when he disappeared. But something was fundamentally wrong with the way he moved. Too fluid, too graceful, like he was floating rather than walking. And his eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's, glowing with an inner light that was definitely not human. "Found me," Kevin said, his voice that same flat monotone. His smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Found me in the hungry dark." "Kevin, are you okay?" Emily asked, but she was backing away from him, pulling me with her. "Fine," Kevin replied, taking a step closer. His head tilted at an unnatural angle like a bird studying prey. "Better than fine. Found something wonderful in the dark. Something that's been waiting so long for company." Michael reached slowly for his knife. "Kevin, you're scaring us. Man, what happened to you out there?" Kevin's too wide smile grew even wider, stretching his face in ways that should have been impossible. "Hungry," he said. "So hungry for so long. But I found food. Want to share with my friends." That's when I saw what was hanging from his belt. In the firelight, I caught a glimpse of something pale and wet, strung on a piece of rope like a grisly necklace. Fingers. Human fingers, some with rings still attached. "Run," I whispered. Kevin's head snapped toward me with predatory speed. "No running," he said, and his voice was no longer Kevin's voice at all. It was deeper, more guttural, with an undertone that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to the primitive fear centers of my brain. No hiding, only feeding. He lunged forward with inhuman speed, moving like liquid shadow. Michael met him with the knife, but Kevin flowed around the blade like it wasn't there and caught Michael's wrist in one clawed hand. The sound Michael made wasn't quite a scream. It was higher, more primal, the sound of prey realizing it's been caught by something it can't fight or reason with. Kevin's jaw unhinged like a snake's, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed wetly in the firelight. He bit down on Michael's throat, and blood sprayed across our campsite in a wide arc, hissing as it hit the flames. Sarah screamed, a sound that seemed to tear her throat raw. Emily grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the darkness. "The trail!" she shouted. "Get to the trail!" We ran blindly into the forest, crashing through undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. Behind us, I could hear wet sounds. Tearing, chewing, and that thing that had been Kevin humming contentedly like it was enjoying a particularly good meal. Our headlamps threw wild circles of light as we ran, illuminating tree trunks and rocks in strobing flashes. Emily led the way, somehow finding the trail in the darkness. We ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, our breath coming in ragged gasps, our hearts pounding like trip hammers. "The road," Emily panted. "If we can reach the road." Behind us, something crashed through the underbrush. Not running, bounding, moving through the forest with predatory grace while we stumbled and fell and picked ourselves up and ran again. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, and I could hear that voice. Kevin's voice, but wrong, so wrong, calling after us. "Don't run, friends," it said, the words carrying impossibly far through the forest. "I just want to share what I found. Just want to show you how good it feels to be truly full." We reached a clearing where the old railroad grade crossed a small stream. In our headlamp beams, I could see the trail continuing on the other side. But between us and safety was 30 feet of open ground where we'd be completely exposed, visible to whatever was hunting us. "Together," Emily whispered, "fast as we can." We broke from the tree line at a dead sprint. Halfway across the clearing, something hit Sarah from behind with the force of a freight train. She went down hard, her scream cut short as the thing that had been Kevin landed on top of her. In the chaotic light of our fallen headlamps, I caught glimpses of what was happening. Kevin's form was changing, becoming something that wasn't entirely human anymore. His limbs had grown longer, his fingers extended into claws, and his face was a nightmare of too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. I skidded to a stop, torn between helping Sarah and saving myself, but Emily grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the far side of the clearing. "She's gone," Emily shouted. "We can't help her." Sarah's screams echoed through the forest, raw and desperate until they suddenly cut off. The wet sounds resumed, accompanied by that satisfied humming. We plunged back into the forest on the far side of the clearing, following the trail by instinct more than sight. My lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, but I kept running. Emily was flagging beside me, stumbling with exhaustion. "Can't," she gasped. "Can't keep going." "Almost there," I lied. I had no idea how far we were from the road. The trail seemed to stretch on forever in the darkness, and our headlamps were starting to dim as the batteries drained. That's when Emily stopped running. I looked back to see her standing in the middle of the trail, her dying headlamp casting weird shadows on her face. Her expression was strange, distant, dreamy, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Emily, we have to keep moving." "I can hear it," she said softly, "in my head, calling to me. It sounds beautiful." My blood went cold. "Emily, no, fight it. Whatever you're hearing, fight it." But she was already changing. Her eyes were losing their focus, becoming distant and glassy. Her mouth opened slightly, and I could see her teeth growing sharper, more pointed. "It's beautiful, James," she whispered. "The hunger. It fills everything. Makes everything simple. No more worry, no more pain, no more fear. Just the sweetness of feeding." She took a step toward me, and I saw her fingernails had grown into claws. "Emily, please." I was backing away from her, but the trail behind me was dark and treacherous. "You're stronger than this. You're the smartest person I know. Don't let it take you." "Hungry," she said, and her voice was becoming that same flat monotone Kevin had used. "So very, very hungry. And you look so filling." She lunged at me with the same inhuman speed Kevin had shown, but I was ready this time. I dodged sideways and ran, leaving the trail entirely and crashing through the underbrush. Branches tore at my face and clothes, roots caught my feet, but I didn't care. I just ran. Behind me, Emily howled, a sound no human throat should be able to make. It was answered by another howl from somewhere else in the forest. Kevin, or what Kevin had become. They were hunting me now, both of them, coordinating their attack like pack predators. I could hear them moving through the forest with that same unnatural grace, closing in from different directions. My headlamp finally died completely, leaving me in absolute darkness. I stumbled and fell, picked myself up and kept going. I had no idea which direction I was heading. I might be running deeper into the forest instead of toward the road. The howls grew closer, and I could hear voices calling my name from the darkness. Kevin's voice, Emily's voice, even Sarah's voice, all begging me to stop running, to come back, to join them in their wonderful hunger. But underneath the familiar tones, I could hear something else, something ancient and inhuman that made my bones ache with terror. Then I saw light ahead. Not electric light, but the pale glow of dawn filtering through the trees. I ran toward it, hope giving me new strength despite my exhaustion. I burst out of the forest onto the dirt road where we'd parked the car. The sight of that dusty Toyota was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I fumbled for the keys. Michael had been carrying them, but we'd all made copies before the trip. The engine turned over on the third try. I threw the car in reverse and floored it, spinning gravel as I backed away from the tree line. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of 3 figures standing at the edge of the forest. They looked human in the dim dawn light, but their eyes reflected my taillights like mirrors, and their smiles showed far too many teeth. I drove faster than was safe on those winding mountain roads, not stopping until I reached Jersey Shore and found the police station. The officers listened to my story with skeptical expressions, but they organized a search and rescue operation anyway. They found our campsite 3 days later. Michael and Sarah's remains were scattered around the dead fire, bones cracked and sucked clean of marrow. The medical examiner ruled it an animal attack. Probably bears, they said. Though privately they admitted the bite marks didn't match any known predator. They never found Kevin or Emily. The search team scoured hundreds of acres but found no trace of them. After 2 weeks, they called off the search and declared them missing, presumed dead. But I know better. They're still out there in those woods, in that dark place where the hunger lives, waiting for the next group of hikers, the next lost souls to stumble into their territory. I moved to California after graduation, as far from those Pennsylvania forests as I could get. But distance doesn't matter when you've looked into the face of something that was once human and seen what we can become when we let the hunger take hold. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear Emily's voice calling my name. And sometimes, when I'm walking alone after dark, I catch a reflection in a shop window that shows too many teeth, eyes that reflect light like an animal's. The doctors say it's PTSD, survivor's guilt manifesting as hallucinations. They've given me medications and therapy and all the tools modern medicine can provide, but they don't understand what I learned in those woods. Some hungers are too powerful to satisfy. Some transformations can't be undone, and some places should never be visited by the living. I carry a silver pendant now, blessed by 3 different churches. I sleep with lights on and check the locks twice every night, because I know that someday, when my guard is down, when I've almost convinced myself it was all just trauma and imagination, I'll hear that familiar voice calling from the darkness. "James," it will say in Emily's sweet voice. "I'm still hungry, James, so very, very hungry. and I remember where you live. And I'll know they've finally found me. My name is David Jones, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pennsylvania's Allegheny National Forest, near the abandoned logging camp at Kinua Creek, 15 miles south of the Kinua Dam. The smell of pine resin and damp earth should have been comforting as our group hiked deeper into the forest that October morning, but something felt wrong from the moment we stepped off the main trail. The air hung too still, and the usual sounds of woodland creatures had fallen unnaturally silent. My work colleagues, Jennifer Williams, Robert Johnson, and Michael Williams, seemed oblivious to the oppressive atmosphere as they chatted about quarterly reports and office gossip, their voices echoing strangely among the towering hemlocks. We'd planned this weekend camping trip for months, a team-building exercise suggested by our manager at the accounting firm. Jennifer, our office coordinator, had researched the location extensively, promising pristine wilderness and complete digital detox. No cell towers for 20 miles, she'd said with excitement. Just us and nature. Now, as we descended into the valley where Kinua Creek carved its way through ancient stone, I wondered if complete isolation had been such a good idea. The October air bit at our exposed skin with unseasonable cold. Robert, always the complainer, pulled his jacket tighter and muttered about the weather forecast being wrong. Michael, ever the optimist, laughed it off and started collecting interesting rocks for his daughter. Jennifer led the way with determined enthusiasm, her blonde ponytail swinging as she consulted her topographical map. According to this, there should be a clearing about half a mile ahead, she announced, her breath visible in small puffs. Perfect spot to set up camp before dark. But as we walked, the shadows seemed to deepen faster than they should have. The trail, clearly marked on Jennifer's map, began to fade until we were following little more than animal paths through increasingly dense undergrowth. Thorny brambles snagged at our backpacks, and the creek's babbling grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to tell us something. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Robert asked, checking his GPS device. His face paled as he stared at the screen. "This says we're in the middle of a lake." Jennifer stopped abruptly and examined her map again, rotating it in her hands with growing confusion. "That's impossible. We should be right here." She pointed to a spot that showed clear trail markers and elevation changes that didn't match our surroundings. Michael peered over her shoulder, his earlier cheerfulness fading. "Maybe we took a wrong turn back at that fallen tree?" I pulled out my phone, hoping for some guidance, but the screen remained black despite having a full charge that morning. "My phone's dead," I said, pressing the power button repeatedly. "Completely drained." "Mine too," Robert said, his voice tight with anxiety. "And my GPS just went crazy. It's showing coordinates that place us in 3 different states simultaneously." The forest around us seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. Every crack of a twig underfoot echoed unnaturally, and I could swear I saw shapes moving just beyond the edge of my vision. Tall, gaunt figures that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. "We should head back," Robert said, his voice cracking slightly. "Something's not right here." But when we turned around, the path we'd just walked had vanished. Where clear trail markers had been visible moments before, only thick undergrowth remained. The trees seemed to have shifted, rearranging themselves into an impenetrable wall of bark and shadow. Jennifer's map fluttered in a breeze that touched nothing else, the paper making dry, whispering sounds like voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. "This is impossible," she whispered, her usual confidence cracking. "Trails don't just disappear." As if summoned by her words, a low howl echoed through the forest. Not quite wolf, not quite human, but something that made every primitive instinct in my body scream danger. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating off the trees until it seemed to originate from inside my own skull. "We need to find shelter," Michael said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. "Get our bearings. Figure out what's going on." We pressed forward through the darkening woods, following the creek's sound toward what we hoped might be the clearing Jennifer had mentioned. The temperature continued to drop with supernatural speed, and frost began forming on the fallen leaves despite the October date. Our breath came in thick clouds, and the moisture seemed to freeze before it could dissipate. The clearing, when we finally stumbled into it, felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Perfectly circular, surrounded by trees that grew in unnaturally straight lines, it looked more like an arena than a natural formation. The grass had been worn away in strange patterns, symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in too many dimensions for human eyes to properly process. "This will have to do," Jennifer said, though her voice lacked conviction. "At least we can see the sky." We set up our tents in the failing light, working quickly as the temperature plummeted further. My fingers grew numb despite my gloves, and the tent stakes seemed to bend and warp as I hammered them into the frozen ground. Robert's tent kept collapsing, the fabric rippling and twisting as if something invisible were pulling at it from the inside. When Michael tried to start a fire, the matches wouldn't light. The striker sparked, but the flame would appear for a fraction of a second before being snuffed out by nothing. When he finally managed to get kindling to catch, the flames burned a sickly green color that cast writhing shadows on the surrounding trees. "That's not normal," Robert said, staring at the fire with wide eyes. "Fire doesn't burn green unless there's copper or—" "It's fine," Jennifer interrupted sharply, though she wouldn't look at the flames directly. "Just the wood, different minerals in the soil." But I could see she was lying. The fire gave off no heat, and the smoke rose in perfectly straight columns despite the wind that had begun to moan through the treetops. Worse, the smoke smelled wrong, sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit mixed with something else I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach churn. We ate a cold dinner of trail mix and energy bars, none of us wanting to admit that our camp stove had also malfunctioned, producing only cold air when we tried to light it. The conversation grew stilted and forced as darkness crept in around us. Every sound seemed amplified: the rustle of leaves, the crack of cooling tree bark, the splash of something large moving in the creek. "Tell me that was a beaver," Michael said as another splash echoed from the water. I peered toward the creek, maybe 30 yards away, and saw ripples spreading across the dark surface. But the ripples were moving in the wrong direction, upstream against the current, and they were too large for any animal that should have been in these waters. "Maybe we should take watches tonight," I suggested. "Just to be safe." Jennifer nodded reluctantly. "Good idea. 2 hours each?" We agreed on the rotation, though none of us mentioned that our watches had stopped working along with everything else electronic. Time seemed to flow differently here anyway, sometimes crawling like cold honey, other times jumping forward in disorienting leaps that left us staring at a sun that had moved farther across the sky than should have been possible. I took the first watch while the others retreated to their tents. The green fire had died to barely glowing embers that provided no warmth and precious little light. The darkness beyond our clearing was absolute, so thick it seemed solid. I could feel it pressing against me, testing the boundaries of our small circle of weak light. That's when I heard the voices. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the trees, but as I listened more carefully, I could make out distinct words, conversations happening just beyond the edge of hearing. The voices sounded familiar, though I couldn't place them. They spoke about work deadlines, weekend plans, family dinners, normal things that felt obscene in this place of wrongness. Then I realized I was hearing our own voices from earlier in the day, played back with subtle differences. In the ghost conversations, Robert agreed to extensions on projects he'd actually complained about. Jennifer made jokes she'd never told. Michael spoke lovingly about a son instead of his daughter. The words were close enough to reality to be recognizable, but wrong enough to make my skin crawl. A twig snapped in the darkness, close enough that I spun toward the sound with my flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness for maybe 3 feet before being swallowed completely, as if the darkness had substance. But in that brief moment of illumination, I saw something that made my breath catch. Footprints in the frost-covered ground. Human footprints, but wrong. Too long, with toes that extended into points and gaps between them that suggested missing digits. The prints led from the forest into our clearing, circled our camp twice, then disappeared at the edge of the dying fire. I wanted to wake the others, but something held me back, a growing certainty that whatever had made those tracks was still watching, waiting for me to make noise, to alert my sleeping friends to danger they couldn't handle. So I sat in silence, flashlight trained on the spot where the footprints vanished, and counted my heartbeats until Michael emerged from his tent to take the next watch. "Anything?" he whispered, settling beside me on a fallen log we'd dragged over to use as a bench. I started to tell him about the footprints, but when I looked back at the ground, they were gone. The frost remained, but the indentations had filled themselves in, leaving only smooth, undisturbed earth. "Just wind," I lied, not wanting to sound crazy. "Weird echoes from the trees." Michael nodded, but I could see he was nervous too. His hands shook slightly as he took the flashlight, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as I retreated to my tent. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams that felt more real than waking. I dreamed of walking through the forest in broad daylight, following a trail that led to a massive lodge made of bones and stretched skin. In the dream, Jennifer was already there, sitting at a table set for 4, but her face was wrong, too thin, with teeth that went back too far into her skull. She smiled at me with predatory hunger and gestured to an empty chair. "David," she said, but her voice came from somewhere behind me instead of her mouth. "You're late for dinner." I jerked awake to find my tent walls rippling and bulging inward, as if something large were pressing against them from outside. The fabric strained and creaked, and I could hear breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations that seemed to go on forever before releasing in wet, rattling sighs. My hand found my knife, a small camping blade that suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. The breathing stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was my own thundering heartbeat. Then something scratched at the tent wall, long, deliberate strokes that sounded like fingernails on fabric, but deeper, more substantial. The scratching moved around the tent slowly, circling me like a predator. When it reached the zippered entrance, it stopped. I held my breath, waiting, every muscle tensed for whatever was coming. The zipper began to move. Not quickly, but with deliberate precision, each metal tooth separating with a tiny metallic whisper. I watched in paralyzed terror as the opening widened inch by inch, revealing not the darkness I expected, but a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from nothing. Through the growing gap, I saw Jennifer's face, but it was wrong in ways that made my mind recoil. Her skin had a waxy, translucent quality, and her eyes were black from lid to lid. When she smiled, her mouth opened too wide, revealing row after row of needle-sharp teeth. "David," she said in her normal voice, though her lips didn't move. "Come outside. We're all waiting for you." Behind her, I could see Robert and Michael standing motionless in the clearing, their backs to me. They swayed slightly as if moved by a breeze I couldn't feel, and their heads were tilted at angles that suggested broken necks. "No," I whispered, clutching my knife. The thing wearing Jennifer's face laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a child's giggle. "But David, we're your friends. Don't you trust us?" I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed my hands over my ears, but her voice continued inside my head, multiplying until it sounded like a chorus of Jennifers all speaking at once. "Come outside, David. Come outside and play. Come outside and feed." When I opened my eyes again, the tent was closed, the zipper firmly secured. Dawn light filtered through the fabric, weak and gray but reassuringly normal. I could hear genuine voices from the clearing, Robert complaining about sleeping on the ground, Michael discussing breakfast options. I emerged from my tent to find my colleagues gathered around a normal fire that crackled cheerfully and gave off actual heat. Our electronic devices were working again, though they showed impossible timestamps and GPS coordinates that placed us in locations we'd never been. "You look terrible," Jennifer said with concern that seemed genuine. "Bad dreams?" I studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of the thing I'd seen in the night, but she appeared perfectly normal. Tired, slightly dirty from camping, but human in all the ways that mattered. "Something like that," I said. We broke camp quickly, eager to find our way back to civilization. But as we packed, I noticed things that made my skin crawl. Robert's sleeping bag was empty in the morning, but the zipper was open from the inside. Michael's backpack had been methodically emptied and repacked, but several items were missing: his first aid kit, most of his food, and the family photos he'd shown us the day before. Most disturbing of all, our food supplies had rotted overnight. Not spoiled, but truly rotted, as if they'd been sitting in tropical humidity for weeks. The smell was overwhelming, sweet decay mixed with something else that reminded me of wet dog and copper pennies. "That's not possible," Robert said, staring at his ruined trail mix. "I bought this yesterday." Jennifer examined her own supplies with growing unease. "It's like it's been here for months." We had no choice but to rely on the few energy bars that remained untainted and try to make our way back to the main trail. But as we hiked, the forest seemed to shift around us again. Paths we remembered taking led to dead ends. Landmarks we'd noted disappeared or moved to impossible locations. By midday, it became clear we were walking in circles. We kept finding our own footprints, but they were always older than they should have been, made in mud that had dried and cracked, pressed into frost that had melted and refrozen multiple times. "This is impossible," Robert said for the dozenth time, his voice rising toward panic. "We've been walking for hours, but we keep ending up in the same place." That's when Jennifer disappeared. We were walking single file along what might have been a game trail when Robert, who was bringing up the rear, called out that Jennifer was gone. She'd been right in front of me, and I'd turned away for maybe 10 seconds to help Michael over a fallen log. When I looked back, the trail behind us was empty. "Jennifer," Michael called, his voice echoing strangely among the trees. "Where are you?" No response came, but I could swear I heard laughter, faint and distant but definitely human. We spread out, calling her name and searching the immediate area. Her footprints led up to a point about 15 feet back on the trail, then simply stopped. Not like she'd stepped off the path, but as if she'd been lifted into the air. We spent the rest of the day looking for her, growing more frantic and disorganized as the hours passed. When darkness fell, we made camp in another clearing that felt identical to the previous one, complete with the same unsettling geometric patterns worn into the earth. Neither Michael nor I slept that night. We took turns maintaining the fire and listening for any sign of Jennifer, but the only sounds were the increasingly frequent splashes from unseen water sources and the voice-like wind that seemed to speak in languages that predated human speech. Jennifer returned with the dawn, walking calmly into our clearing as if she'd simply stepped away to relieve herself. She was clean, too clean for someone who'd spent the night in the woods. Her clothes were pressed, her hair was perfectly styled, and she smelled like expensive perfume instead of wood smoke and fear. "Where were you?" Robert demanded, rushing to her side. "We looked everywhere." Jennifer smiled, but it was the same too-wide smile I'd seen in my tent the night before. "I went for a walk, got turned around for a bit." Her voice was perfectly normal, but there was something wrong with her breathing. She spoke without exhaling, as if she no longer needed air. "A walk?" Michael said incredulously. "Jennifer, you were gone for almost 24 hours. We were about to hike out and get help." She tilted her head at an angle that was just slightly too far, like a bird studying something interesting. Was I? It only felt like a few minutes. I watched her carefully as we prepared to break camp again. She moved normally, spoke normally, but there were small details that set off every alarm bell in my primitive brain. She didn't blink often enough. When she smiled, I could see too many teeth. And her shadow, when the light hit her at certain angles, didn't quite match her movements. But Robert and Michael seemed to accept her explanation, or at least they wanted to believe it enough to ignore the inconsistencies. People see what they need to see, especially when the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. We resumed our search for the main trail, but the forest had become actively hostile now. Branches that hadn't been there moments before caught at our clothes and skin. Roots rose from the ground to trip us. The very air seemed to thicken, making each breath an effort. Jennifer led the way with confident steps, as if she knew exactly where she was going. But the path she chose led us deeper into the wilderness, away from any hope of finding civilization. When Robert questioned her navigation, she turned and smiled with those too many teeth. "Trust me," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "I know exactly where we're going." That's when I realized she wasn't Jennifer anymore. Whatever had taken her during the night was wearing her face like a mask, leading us to something that waited in the deep woods, something that was hungry and patient and very, very old. The thing that looked like Jennifer began to hum as we walked, a melody that seemed familiar but wrong, like a childhood lullaby played in a minor key. The sound made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. Behind me, I could hear Robert and Michael humming along, their voices harmonizing in ways that hurt to listen to. By late afternoon, we reached a valley I'd never seen on any map of the Allegheny National Forest. The trees here were ancient beyond measure, their trunks so massive that 5 people linking hands couldn't have encircled them. The bark was black and seemed to weep a substance that stained the ground in patterns that resembled hieroglyphs. At the center of the valley stood a structure that defied rational explanation. Part building, part organism, constructed from materials that might have been wood but gleamed like bone. It pulsed with its own rhythm, expanding and contracting like something breathing. "We're here," Jennifer said, and her voice was no longer trying to sound human. That's when Robert and Michael turned to look at me, and I saw that they were gone too. Their eyes were black pits, and their faces had taken on the same waxy quality I'd seen in my tent. They moved in perfect synchronization, like marionettes controlled by the same hand. "David," they said in unison, their voices creating harmonics that made reality shimmer. "Come inside. Meet our host. He's been waiting so long to meet you." I ran. My feet pounded against the forest floor as I crashed through undergrowth that seemed to reach for me with thorned fingers. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but gliding through the trees with impossible grace. Their laughter echoed from all directions, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, as if they were everywhere at once. The forest became a maze of thorns and shadows that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. I stumbled and fell dozens of times, my hands and face becoming bloody from the grasping branches. But each time I fell, I could hear them getting closer, their inhuman laughter growing louder. I don't know how long I ran. Time had no meaning in that place. The sun never seemed to move, hanging in the same position in the sky like a dead eye watching my flight. My legs burned and my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. To stop was to become like them, to join whatever waited in that breathing building at the heart of the valley. When I finally collapsed from exhaustion, I found myself back in our original clearing, the one where this nightmare had begun. But it was different now, older as if decades had passed. The stones we'd arranged around our fire pit were covered in moss. Our tent stakes had rusted to nothing. I crawled to where Jennifer's tent had been and found something that made my blood freeze. A pile of bones, bleached white by time and weather. Human bones, arranged in a neat stack with the skull on top. Carved into the forehead was a symbol that hurt to look at, the same symbol I'd seen worn into the grass when we first arrived. My phone, impossibly, began to work. The screen flickered to life, showing dozens of missed calls and text messages. The date stamp made no sense. According to my phone, I'd been gone for 3 months. The first message was from my office, asking where I was. The second was from Jennifer's mother, asking if I'd heard from her daughter. The messages grew more frantic as the days passed. then tapered off into the resigned tone of people who'd given up hope. The final message was from my own mother, sent just hours ago. "David, I don't know if you'll get this, but the police say you're probably dead. Jennifer's family is having a memorial service next week. I hope wherever you are, you found peace." I tried to call for help, but the phone only produced static. The static resolved into voices. Jennifer, Robert, and Michael calling my name from impossibly far away. They sounded sad, disappointed. "David," Jennifer's voice whispered through the static, "why did you run? We only wanted to share what we found. Come back to us. Come back and see what we've become." I threw the phone as hard as I could, watching it shatter against a tree. But the voices continued, coming from the wind, from the creek, from the very earth beneath my feet. I began walking, choosing directions at random, desperate to find any trace of the modern world. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of trees and shadows that led nowhere. But as the sun finally began to set, the first real sunset I'd seen since entering this place, I stumbled onto an actual trail. Not a game path or deer track, but a real hiking trail with blazes and mile markers. I followed it with growing hope until I reached a trailhead parking lot. My car was there, exactly where I'd left it, but covered in months of dust and leaves. The interior was filled with the smell of decay, and something had built a nest in the back seat using materials I didn't want to examine too closely. The engine turned over on the third try, and I drove away from that place as fast as the winding mountain roads would allow. I didn't stop until I reached the interstate, and even then, I kept checking my mirrors for any sign of pursuit. But I made it out. I survived whatever that place was, whatever had taken my friends and tried to take me. The rational part of my mind wants to believe it was some kind of shared psychological break, a group hallucination brought on by stress and environmental factors. But I know better. I know because sometimes, late at night, I still hear their voices calling to me. Jennifer, Robert, and Michael trying to convince me to come back. They promise me wonders beyond imagination, pleasures beyond human comprehension, knowledge that would remake my understanding of reality. And sometimes, God help me, I'm tempted to listen. The police found no trace of my missing colleagues. The search and rescue teams explored every inch of the Allegheny National Forest but discovered nothing. According to official records, 3 people simply vanished without a trace while on a camping trip. I tried to tell them about the valley, about the breathing building and the thing that wore Jennifer's face. But my descriptions were too vague, too impossible. The coordinates I gave them led to empty forest with no sign that anyone had ever been there. The therapist my insurance company assigned says I'm suffering from survivor's guilt, that my mind has created elaborate fantasies to cope with whatever really happened to my friends. She prescribes medication and suggests support groups for people who've lost colleagues in outdoor accidents. But she doesn't understand. None of them do. Because what happened in those woods wasn't an accident. It was a feeding. And somewhere in the deep places of Pennsylvania's wilderness, something ancient and hungry is still waiting for the next group of lost souls to stumble into its domain. I've moved across the country, changed my name, started a new life. But distance doesn't matter to the things that live in the spaces between reality. They're patient. They have all the time in the world. And sometimes, when I'm driving through unfamiliar forests or hiking in places that feel too quiet, I catch glimpses of familiar faces watching me from the trees. Jennifer's smile, Robert's worried frown, Michael's kind eyes. They follow me everywhere now, these echoes of the friends I couldn't save. The worst part is knowing they're still out there, still calling to other hikers, other lost souls who might mistake their voices for rescue. The thing that took them, the Wendigo, the forest god, whatever name you want to give to ancient hunger, it's still feeding. And my friends, or what's left of them, are helping it hunt. I dream about them every night. In my dreams, they're exactly as they were before. Human, warm, alive, We sit around a normal campfire eating normal food and sharing normal stories. But when I wake up, I can taste copper in my mouth and smell rotting fruit in my room. They want me to come back. They've made that clear in 100 different ways. Phone calls from numbers that don't exist. Letters delivered to addresses where I've never lived. Voices on the wind that speak my name with perfect pronunciation. But I won't go back. I can't. Because I know what waits for me in that valley where the trees bleed black sap and the very air hungers for human flesh. I know what my friends have become, and I know what they want to make me. So I run. I keep moving, keep changing locations, keep hoping that distance and time will somehow break the connection between us. But deep down, I know the truth. You can't escape something that exists in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next. The Wendigo is patient. It's been waiting in those woods for longer than human civilization has existed, and it can wait longer still. And my friends, my poor transformed friends, will keep calling to me across the darkness until I finally answer, until I finally come home. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Hammersley Wild area of north-central Pennsylvania, deep in the heart of what locals call the Forgotten Country, a stretch of wilderness so remote that even the park rangers avoid it during winter months. I'd been planning this solo backpacking trip for months, needing desperately to escape the suffocating routine of my insurance adjuster job in Philadelphia. My German Shepherd, Ranger, was my only companion, a decision I'd made after my divorce finalized 6 months earlier. Sarah had taken everything else. At least she'd left me the dog. The October air bit sharp against my face as I shouldered my pack at the Pine Creek trailhead. Ranger's breath formed small clouds as he panted with excitement, his thick coat already adapting to the dropping temperatures. The forecast called for 3 days of clear weather, perfect for the 40-mile loop trail I'd mapped through some of Pennsylvania's most untouched wilderness. "Just you and me, boy," I whispered, scratching behind Ranger's ears. His tail wagged against my leg, the sound muffled by the dead leaves carpeting the forest floor. The first day passed without incident. We made good time through the maple and oak groves, their leaves creating a brilliant canopy of orange and red overhead. By evening, we'd covered nearly 15 miles and reached a small clearing beside Hammersley Creek. The sound of rushing water would normally have been soothing, but something felt wrong about the silence between the water's whispers. As I set up camp, Ranger began acting strangely. His ears kept swiveling toward the tree line, and twice he issued low, rumbling growls at nothing I could see. When I called his name, he'd look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but something deeper. Wariness. Recognition of something I couldn't perceive. "What is it, boy?" I asked, following his gaze into the darkening woods. The trees seemed to press closer than they had during daylight, their shadows creating a maze of black spaces that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. Dinner was a simple affair. Dehydrated beef stew heated over my portable stove. Ranger barely touched his food, instead maintaining his vigil at the edge of our small circle of light. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since sunset, and my breath now formed visible clouds with each exhalation. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound like breaking branches, but rhythmic, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line, but the light seemed swallowed by the forest, creating only a weak cone of visibility that made the surrounding darkness appear even more absolute. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Anyone there?" The sound stopped immediately, as if something had been listening and now knew exactly where we were. Ranger let out a whine that made my skin crawl, not his usual attention-seeking noise, but something primal and desperate. He backed closer to me, his body trembling against my leg. I spent the night in my sleeping bag fully clothed, my hunting knife within arm's reach and my flashlight gripped in my hand. Every few minutes, I'd sweep the beam around our campsite, checking the perimeter. Ranger never slept, his yellow eyes reflecting the light whenever I turned the beam toward him. Dawn came gray and cold, with a mist rising from the creek that seemed to muffle all sound. As I packed up camp, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the soft earth beside the water. Not boot prints, bare feet, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like claw marks where toes should have been. I told myself they were just unusual animal tracks, maybe a bear with deformed paws. But deep down, in that primitive part of my brain that evolution had programmed to recognize danger, I knew better. The second day's hike took us deeper into the wilderness, following an old logging road that had been reclaimed by the forest decades ago. The path was barely visible, marked only by occasional blazes on trees and the subtle indentation where countless feet had once traveled. Ranger seemed better during daylight hours, though he stayed closer to me than usual. His nose worked constantly, reading scents I couldn't detect. Twice he stopped abruptly and looked back the way we'd come, his hackles rising. "We're being followed, aren't we?" I asked him during one of these episodes. His only response was to press against my leg and urge me forward with his body. By mid-afternoon, we reached what my map labeled as Devil's Backbone Ridge, a narrow stretch of trail that wound along the spine of a hill with steep drops on both sides. The name proved uncomfortably appropriate as storm clouds gathered overhead, turning the afternoon light gray and sickly. I was checking my GPS when I realized it was showing our location as somewhere in northern Canada. The screen flickered, displaying coordinates that made no sense, then went completely black. When I tried to restart it, the device wouldn't respond. "No big deal," I muttered, pulling out my paper map and compass. "We'll navigate old school." But the map seemed wrong too. The contour lines didn't match the terrain around us, and the creek we'd been following appeared to have vanished entirely. According to the map, we should have been standing in a valley, but I could see clearly that we were on a ridgetop. That's when I noticed the trees. Every single one along the ridge bore a mark about 7 feet off the ground. Deep gouges in the bark, too high for any normal animal to have made. The marks were fresh, with sap still weeping from the wounds. They formed a rough pattern, almost like symbols, carved into tree after tree stretching into the distance. Ranger's behavior became increasingly agitated as we passed each marked tree. He would whine and pull toward the downhill side of the trail, as if trying to lead us away from whatever had made those markings. As evening approached, I faced a decision. My original plan called for camping at a designated site another 5 miles ahead, but the approaching storm and my dog's obvious distress made me reconsider. I decided to set up camp in a small clearing just below the ridgeline, sheltered by a cluster of enormous pine trees. The wind picked up as I struggled with my tent, and Ranger began barking at something in the woods. Not his normal bark. This was frantic, desperate, filled with terror I'd never heard from him before. "Ranger, quiet!" I hissed, but he ignored me completely. Then I saw what he was barking at. A figure stood among the trees about 50 yards away, barely visible in the fading light. At first glance, it looked like a person. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothing. But something about its proportions was wrong. Its arms hung too low, nearly reaching the ground. Its head seemed too small for its body, perched atop a neck that stretched unnaturally long. I fumbled for my flashlight, but by the time I got it turned on, the figure had vanished. The beam revealed nothing but empty forest and swaying branches. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Ranger, who had finally stopped barking but continued to stare fixedly at the spot where the figure had been. I finished setting up camp as quickly as possible, my hands shaking from more than just the cold. The storm arrived with full force just as I crawled into my tent, bringing horizontal rain and wind that made the walls billow and snap like a ship's sail. Over the sound of the storm, I could hear something else, footsteps circling our campsite. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause at each cardinal direction before moving on. Ranger pressed against me inside the tent, his body rigid with tension. The footsteps continued for hours, sometimes coming close enough that I could hear breathing outside the thin nylon walls. I lay awake, clutching my knife, listening to whatever was out there test the boundaries of our small sanctuary. Sometime after midnight, the sounds stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. I must have dozed off eventually because I was awakened by Ranger's absence. The warm weight that had been pressed against my side was gone. I sat up quickly, realizing that the tent flap was partially unzipped. "Ranger?" I called softly. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled outside. The storm had passed, leaving the air crystal clear and bitterly cold. Stars blazed overhead with an intensity I'd never seen in the city, but their light seemed to make the shadows between the trees even darker. "Ranger!" I called more loudly, sweeping my flashlight beam across the clearing. A bark answered me from somewhere downhill, deeper in the forest. It sounded like Ranger, but something about the tone seemed off, too high, lasting too long. I followed the sound, crashing through underbrush with my flashlight held high. Branches caught at my clothing and scratched my face, but I pushed forward, calling my dog's name. The barking led me deeper into the woods, always seeming to come from just ahead, just out of sight. I stumbled over fallen logs and through patches of thick brambles, my beam creating a small pool of light in an ocean of darkness. After what felt like hours of searching, I found him. Ranger sat in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from our campsite, perfectly still, facing away from me. His posture was wrong. Too rigid, too formal. Dogs didn't sit like that. "Ranger?" I approached cautiously. "Come here, boy." He turned his head to look at me, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. It was Ranger's face, but not his eyes. The warm brown eyes that had looked at me with devotion for 3 years were gone, replaced by something pale and cold that reflected my light like mirrors. His mouth hung open in what might have been a grin, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than I remembered. "Ranger," I whispered. He tilted his head at an impossible angle, nearly 90 degrees to the left, and made a sound that was almost like his usual whine, but wrong in every way. Too long, too human, too intelligent. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. This thing wearing my dog's face stood up with mechanical precision and began walking toward me. Its gait was wrong. Too stiff, like a marionette being operated by someone who had never seen a real dog move. I turned and ran, and branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the forest, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. Behind me, I could hear pursuit. Not the sound of paws on leaves, but something else. Something that moved through the trees without disturbing them. Something that breathed with lungs that were too large and too empty. I burst into our campsite and dove for my backpack, frantically digging for the flare gun I always carried for emergencies. My hands shook so badly I could barely load the flare, but I managed to point it toward the tree line just as the thing that looked like Ranger emerged from the woods. In the harsh red light of the flare, I could see what it really was. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall, emaciated to the point where its ribs showed through pale, mottled skin. Its arms hung down to its knees, ending in hands that had too many fingers, each tipped with black claws. But the worst part was its face, a grotesque mockery of human features stretched over a skull that was clearly not meant for them. And perched on top of its head like a crown was a perfect replica of Ranger's fur and ears. It had been wearing my dog like a mask. The creature's mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and it made that sound again. My dog's whine twisted into something obscene and hungry. I fired the flare directly at its chest. The projectile struck home with a shower of sparks, and the creature let out a shriek that sounded like breaking glass mixed with a dying animal's last breath. It staggered backward, clawing at the burning phosphorus embedded in its flesh. I didn't wait to see if the wound was fatal. I grabbed my pack and ran into the forest, leaving my tent and most of my gear behind. The thing's screams followed me through the trees, echoing off the hills and seeming to come from every direction at once. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled with exhaustion. When I finally stopped, I found myself on a rocky outcropping that offered a view of the valley below. In the distance, I could see lights, the warm yellow glow of windows in what had to be a house or cabin. Civilization, safety. It took me another 3 hours of stumbling through the darkness to reach the lights. The cabin belonged to an elderly man named Edgar Moss, who took one look at my scratched face and wild eyes and invited me inside without question. "You look like you've seen the devil himself," Edgar said, pouring me a cup of coffee that scalded my throat and brought feeling back to my hands. I told him what had happened, expecting disbelief or suggestions that I'd suffered from hypothermia-induced hallucinations. Instead, Edgar nodded grimly. "Sounds like you met old hollow bones," he said. "That's what the local Seneca called them, back when there were still Seneca around here. White folks gave them different names. Wendigo, Windigo, Wedico. Doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is that you got away." "What about my dog?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Edgar's expression grew sad. "I'm sorry, son. Your dog's been gone since that first night. What you saw wasn't him anymore." I spent 2 days at Edgar's cabin, slowly recovering my strength and waiting for the state police to arrive. When they finally did, they found my abandoned campsite exactly as I described it. Tent still standing, gear scattered around, signs of a struggle. But they found no trace of Ranger, living or dead. The official report listed my dog as lost in the wilderness and my story as trauma-induced delusions brought on by exposure and hypothermia. The investigating officer, a kind woman named Sergeant Martinez, quietly advised me to never return to the Hammersley wild area. "Some places," she said, "aren't meant for people." I never found out what happened to the real Ranger. Sometimes I like to think he died quickly that first night before the thing could use his form for its deception. Other times, in my darkest moments, I wonder if some part of him was still trapped inside that grotesque mockery, forced to watch helplessly as the creature used his body to hunt me. I moved out of Pennsylvania 3 months later, relocating to Arizona where the desert sun burns away shadows and there are no deep forests to hide ancient horrors. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls through the canyon outside my new home, I hear a sound that might be a dog barking. And the part of me that survived those 3 days in the Hammersley wild area knows that somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, something is still wearing my dog's face and waiting for the next hiker to wander too far from the marked trails. The hunger never dies. It only sleeps, dreaming of warm flesh and the taste of fear. Edgar Moss was found dead in his cabin 6 weeks after I left Pennsylvania. According to the coroner's report, he died of a heart attack. But the local sheriff mentioned off the record that all the windows in Edgar's cabin had been shattered from the inside, and there were strange tracks in the snow around his property. Tracks that looked almost like human feet, but wrong somehow. Too long, with claw marks where toes should have been. I never owned another dog. Even now, 5 years later, I can't bring myself to trust that warm brown eyes and a wagging tail belong to anything innocent. Because I learned in those Pennsylvania woods that evil doesn't always announce itself with fangs and claws. Sometimes it comes to you wearing the face of something you love, speaking with a voice you trust, asking you to follow it deeper into the darkness where the hungry things are waiting. And sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I wonder if the thing I shot with that flare actually died, or if it's still out there in the Hammersley wild area, learning new faces, perfecting new voices, becoming better at the hunt. The thought keeps me awake most nights, because if it survived, if it's still learning and growing stronger, then eventually it might decide that Pennsylvania isn't big enough anymore. It might start wandering, spreading its hunger to new forests, new victims, and someday it might remember the man who burned its chest and got away. Someday it might come looking for me. I've made peace with that possibility. My apartment in Phoenix has no ground floor windows, and I keep industrial-strength flares in every room. I've learned to sleep with one eye open and to never trust anything that moves in the darkness. But most importantly, I've learned that there are places in this world where human beings were never meant to go. Places where things older than our civilization still hunger in the shadows between the trees. The Hammersley Wild Area is one of those places. And if you're reading this, if you're planning a hiking trip through Pennsylvania's remote wilderness areas, please remember my story. Remember that not everything that looks familiar can be trusted. Remember that the forest has its own rules, its own hungry residents who have been waiting in the darkness long before the first human ever set foot on this continent. Remember that some hungers can never be satisfied, only temporarily appeased. And if you're hiking alone with your dog, if you hear footsteps circling your campsite in the dead of night, if your faithful companion disappears and returns acting strangely, run. Don't look back. Don't try to save what's already lost. Just run, and pray that whatever found you in the darkness decides you're not worth the chase. Because in the end, we're all just meat wandering through a world that's far stranger and more dangerous than we dare to admit. And in places like the Hammersley Wild Area, that meat is always on the menu. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Susuanic State Forest, Pennsylvania, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my co-workers from the accounting firm. The 5 of us had been planning this trip for months. Sarah Rodriguez, our department supervisor, thought it would be good for team building. She'd convinced the rest of us, David Jones, our newest hire who was eager to impress, Jennifer Brown, who'd been with the company for 8 years and knew every hiking trail in a 3-state radius, and Kevin Young, whose outdoor gear obsession bordered on the pathological, that we needed to disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with nature. Looking back, I wish we'd stayed connected to something, anything that might have kept us tethered to sanity. We drove up on Friday afternoon in 2 cars, Jennifer leading the way in her Jeep while the rest of us followed in David's SUV. The plan was to camp at a primitive site Jennifer had found deep in the forest, miles from any established campground. "It's completely untouched," she'd said with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never encountered something that should remain untouched. No cell towers, no other campers, just pure wilderness. The drive took us deeper into Pennsylvania's northern tier than I'd ever been. We passed through tiny towns with names like Cross Fork and Gailton, places that looked like time had forgotten them sometime in the 1950s. The roads grew narrower, the pavement gave way to gravel, and eventually even the gravel petered out into nothing but packed earth and fallen leaves. Jennifer's Jeep bounced ahead of us, following what could generously be called a logging road. The canopy overhead grew thicker, blocking out more and more of the October sky until we were driving through a green-tinged twilight even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. David gripped the steering wheel tighter as branches scraped against the windows. "You sure Jennifer knows where she's going?" Kevin asked from the back seat, his voice carrying the first note of unease I'd heard from him all day. "She's been doing this for years," Sarah replied, but I caught her checking her phone. No signal. Mine had died sometime after we'd left the main highway. We finally stopped at a small clearing surrounded by towering white pines and ancient oaks. The trees pressed in from all sides, their branches interlocking overhead like the fingers of clasped hands. Jennifer was already out of her Jeep, breathing deeply and spreading her arms wide. "Isn't this perfect?" she called out. "Listen to that silence." But it wasn't silent. Not exactly. There was a quality to the quiet that felt wrong, like holding your breath underwater. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant creaking of wood under pressure. We set up camp as the real twilight began to fall. Kevin, true to form, had brought enough gear to outfit a small expedition. His tent alone was larger than my apartment's bedroom, complete with battery-powered lanterns and a portable camp stove that could probably be seen from space. The rest of us made do with more modest accommodations. Sarah and I were sharing a two-person tent, which had seemed like a practical arrangement when we'd planned it back in the fluorescent-lit safety of the office. Jennifer had her own single-person backpacking tent, while David had borrowed a beat-up dome tent from his brother. We arranged them in a rough circle around the fire pit Jennifer had already started constructing. As darkness fell proper, the temperature dropped faster than it should have in mid-October. Our breath began to mist, and Kevin started obsessing over the weather forecast he'd checked before losing cell service. "It was supposed to stay in the 60s, he muttered, pulling on a heavier jacket. "Maybe 70s during the day." The fire Jennifer built seemed smaller than it should be, casting dancing shadows that reached too far into the trees. We'd brought hot dogs and s'mores ingredients, standard camping fare, but none of us seemed to have much appetite. The hot dogs tasted flat, lifeless, and the marshmallows wouldn't brown properly no matter how close we held them to the flames. "So," David said, trying to break the uncomfortable silence that had settled over us, "anyone know any good ghost stories?" "Don't," Jennifer said sharply. "Not here." We all looked at her. Jennifer, who would rappel down cliff faces for fun and had once solo-hiked the entire Appalachian Trail through Pennsylvania, looked genuinely spooked. "What do you mean, not here?" Sarah asked. Jennifer stared into the fire, her face pale in the orange light. "There are stories about this area, old stories, the kind the local rangers don't talk about with tourists." "What kind of stories?" Kevin leaned forward, his gear-obsessed practicality warring with obvious curiosity. "Native American legends, mostly. The Seneca used to hunt in these forests, but there were places they wouldn't go, sacred places, cursed places." She gestured vaguely at the trees around us, places where the hungry spirits lived. David laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, Jen, you're starting to sound like the beginning of a bad horror movie." "The Seneca had a word," Jennifer continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Wendigo. A creature that was once human, but had been consumed by such desperate hunger that it became something else. Something that could never be satisfied, no matter how much it devoured." "Wendigo," I corrected automatically. "I think you mean Wendigo." Jennifer's eyes met mine across the fire, and I saw something there that made my stomach clench. "No," she said quietly. "Not Wendigo. Wendigo. That's what the Seneca called the ones that lived here. The old ones. The ones that learned to hide." A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. In the brief flare of light, I could have sworn I saw something moving between the trees behind Jennifer. When I blinked and looked again, there was nothing but darkness. We went to bed not long after that, the uncomfortable conversation having killed any desire for camaraderie. Sarah and I settled into our sleeping bags without much talk. She fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, or rather, the continued absence of sounds. Sometime during the night, I was awakened by the sound of our tent zipper being slowly pulled down. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering as something, or someone, carefully unzipped the entire front panel of our tent. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of decay and something else, something organic and wrong. I waited for Sarah to wake up, for whoever was outside to say something, to do something. But there was only the sound of slow, measured breathing that wasn't coming from either of us. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the zipper slowly closed again. In the morning, Sarah had no memory of the tent being opened. "You must have dreamed it," she said, but she looked pale and tired, as if she hadn't slept well either. David's tent had somehow ended up 20 feet from where he'd set it up the night before. He insisted he must have moved it himself and forgotten, but the expression on his face suggested he didn't believe his own explanation. Kevin's elaborate camp stove wouldn't light. He spent an hour checking fuel lines and connections, muttering increasingly creative profanity, before finally admitting defeat. We ate cold Pop-Tarts for breakfast and agreed to hike to a nearby stream Jennifer knew about to refill our water bottles. The forest felt different in daylight, but not better. If anything, the wrongness was more pronounced. The trees seemed too close together, their branches forming an almost solid canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The temperature remained unseasonably cold, and our breath still misted despite what should have been a warming sun. Jennifer led us along what she claimed was a game trail, but I couldn't see any signs of animal passage. No hoof prints, no scat, no nibbled vegetation. The forest floor was covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves that muffled our footsteps until we moved through the woods like ghosts. We'd been walking for about an hour when David stopped suddenly. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked. We all stood still, listening. At first, there was only the familiar non-silence of the forest. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, almost like chanting. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees until it was impossible to determine its source. "Probably just wind," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. The sound grew louder as we continued toward the stream, resolving into something that was definitely not wind. It was voices, multiple voices, speaking in unison in a language I didn't recognize. The words had a guttural, primitive quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. "We should go back," Kevin said. "This is someone else's ceremony or something. We're trespassing." But Jennifer was already moving forward, drawn by some compulsion I couldn't understand. "It's just over this ridge," she said. "The stream is just over this ridge." We crested a small hill and found ourselves looking down into a natural amphitheater formed by the surrounding trees. At the bottom, next to what should have been a clear mountain stream, stood a circle of 7 figures. They might have been human once. They wore the tattered remains of clothing, jeans, flannel shirts, hiking boots, but their limbs were wrong, elongated and twisted at impossible angles. Their skin had a grayish, mottled appearance, like something that had been left underwater too long. And they were thin, impossibly thin, as if they'd been stretched out and all the substance had been drained from them. They stood around something in the center of their circle, something that might have been an animal but was too mangled to identify. Their voices rose and fell in that alien chant, and steam rose from whatever they were clustered around. That's when I realized the stream wasn't clear mountain water. It ran thick and dark like old blood mixed with motor oil. David took a step backward and snapped a branch under his foot. The sound cracked through the forest like a gunshot. All 7 figures turned toward us in perfect unison. Their faces were the worst part. Sunken, hollow, with 2 large eyes that reflected light like an animal's. But worse than that was the intelligence in those eyes, the terrible awareness that this had once been human and remembered what it had lost. One of them opened its mouth and let out a sound that was part shriek, part howl, and part something else entirely. The others joined in, and the noise was so loud and wrong that I fell to my knees with my hands pressed over my ears. "Run," Jennifer whispered, then louder, "Run!" We scrambled back up the ridge, crashing through the underbrush with no concern for stealth. Behind us, that awful chorus continued, joined now by the sound of pursuit. I didn't look back, but I could hear branches breaking and leaves rustling as something, multiple somethings, followed us. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally stopping only when Kevin collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. We were back at our campsite, though I had no memory of how we'd found our way there. "What were those things?" David asked between ragged breaths. Jennifer was staring back the way we'd come, her face white as bone. "I don't know," she said, "but we need to leave. Now." We broke camp in record time, throwing gear into bags without any concern for organization. Kevin's expensive equipment got stuffed into garbage bags. David's borrowed tent got shoved into his SUV still partially assembled. That's when we discovered the cars wouldn't start. David turned the key in his SUV's ignition and got nothing but a clicking sound. Jennifer's Jeep was equally dead. We popped the hoods and found that every rubber component in both engines, belts, hoses, gaskets, had rotted away completely. They looked like they'd been soaking in acid for years. "How is this possible?" Kevin demanded, staring at the dissolved remains of what had been a perfectly functional alternator belt just hours earlier. "How does rubber just disintegrate overnight?" "It doesn't," Sarah said quietly. "Not naturally." We were stranded 40 miles from the nearest town with no working vehicles and no cell phone signal. The sun was already past its zenith, and with the thick canopy overhead, night would come early. "We hike out," Jennifer decided. "Follow the logging road back to the main trail. It's a long walk, but we can make it." But when we tried to find the logging road we'd driven in on, it wasn't there, not just overgrown or blocked, completely gone. Where there should have been a clear path through the trees, there was only more forest, ancient and untouched as if no vehicle had ever passed through it. David pulled out his GPS unit, one of Kevin's high-end toys that should have worked regardless of cell service. The screen showed only static. "The compass," Sarah said. "At least we can find north." But the compass needle spun lazily in circles, never settling on any particular direction. We were lost. Completely, impossibly lost in a forest that no longer followed any natural laws. "This isn't happening," David said, his voice rising toward panic. "GPS doesn't just stop working. Compasses don't just break. Cars don't just dissolve." "Maybe we should try to find those people again," Kevin suggested. "Ask for help." "Those weren't people," Jennifer said firmly, "and we're not going anywhere near that stream again." Night fell faster than it should have, the temperature dropping so quickly that frost began forming on our gear. We rebuilt the fire, using up most of our remaining firewood in an attempt to stay warm. The flames seemed smaller and weaker than before, casting barely enough light to see each other's faces. That's when Sarah started acting strange. It began with small things. She kept staring off into the trees, her head tilted as if she were listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. When David asked her a direct question about rationing our remaining food, she didn't respond for a full minute, then answered as if he'd just spoken. "Sarah?" I reached over to touch her shoulder. "You okay?" She turned to look at me, and for just a moment her eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice had a flat, mechanical quality. "Just tired." We all agreed to take watches through the night. David volunteered for first shift, then Kevin, then me. Sarah said she wasn't feeling well and needed to rest. I was awakened from a deep sleep by the sound of screaming. David's voice, raw with terror, cut through the night. "Sarah, what are you doing? Sarah, stop!" He unzipped my tent and stumbled out into the cold night air. Kevin and Jennifer were already up, looking around frantically with flashlights. David was standing at the edge of our campsite, staring into the trees. "She just walked off," he said, his voice shaking. "She stood up and walked straight into the forest. When I called after her, she turned around and looked at me, but it wasn't. It wasn't her face." "What do you mean?" Jennifer demanded. It was her face, but wrong. Like someone had taken a photograph of Sarah and stretched it. Her mouth was too wide, and her eyes were too far apart, and she was smiling this terrible smile. We called Sarah's name until our throats were raw, but got no response. The beam of our flashlights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness just a few feet from the camp. "We have to find her," I said. "No," Jennifer said firmly. "We don't go into those woods at night. Whatever took Sarah, whatever she's become, we don't follow." "She's our friend," I protested. "She was our friend," Jennifer corrected. "What walked into those trees isn't Sarah anymore." We spent the rest of the night huddled around the dying fire, taking turns watching the edge of the campsite. None of us saw Sarah again, but around 3 a.m, we heard her voice calling to us from somewhere deep in the forest. "Michael," came the voice, perfectly mimicking Sarah's tone and inflection. "Michael, I'm hurt. I need help." I started to stand up, but Kevin grabbed my arm. "Don't," he whispered. "Listen to where it's coming from." The voice was coming from directly above us, as if Sarah were somehow calling down from the treetops. "Michael, please, I'm bleeding. I can't find my way back." Then David's voice joined hers. "Kevin, you need to come help us. We found the way out." But David was sitting right next to me. The voices continued through the night, sometimes alone, sometimes together, calling to each of us by name and pleading for help. They knew things only our real friends could know. Shared memories, inside jokes, personal details. But they were calling from impossible directions, from underground, from high in the trees, from multiple locations at once. Dawn came gray and cold, but it came. The voices stopped with the first light. We were down to 3 people, and we all knew we weren't getting out of this alive. Kevin tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy by inventorying our remaining supplies. We had maybe 2 days of food if we rationed carefully, and the temperature was still dropping. Our water bottles had ice forming on top despite being kept close to the fire. "We need to try walking out again," he said. "In daylight. The road has to be there." But Jennifer was shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. Don't you see? We're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. Normal rules don't apply here. This place, these things, they're not bound by geography or physics or anything else we understand." "Then what do you suggest?" David demanded. "We just sit here and wait to die?" "I suggest we figure out what they want," Jennifer replied. "Maybe we can bargain with them." That afternoon, while the others tried unsuccessfully to get a signal on various electronic devices, I sat by the fire and thought about everything that had happened. The rotted rubber in our engines, the missing road, the broken compass and GPS, the impossible voices in the night. Sarah walking into the forest with that stretched, wrong face. I was beginning to suspect that Jennifer knew more about our situation than she was telling us. Her knowledge of local folklore had been too specific, too detailed, and she'd been the one to lead us here, to this particular spot deep in the forest. When David and Kevin wandered off to try to find higher ground for a cell signal, I confronted her. "You knew," I said. "You knew what was out here." Jennifer looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I suspected." "Why did you bring us here?" "Because I didn't have a choice." She stared into the fire, her face haggard. "My brother came camping in these woods 5 years ago. He never came back. The rangers found his campsite, but no trace of him. No body, no signs of struggle, nothing." "So you thought you'd bring more people to feed to whatever took him?" "No." Her head snapped up, eyes blazing. "I thought if I came back with a group, if there were more of us, maybe I could find out what happened to him. Maybe I could get him back. Your brother's dead, Jennifer." "Is he?" She gestured toward the trees. "Is Sarah dead? Or is she something else now? Something that remembers being human but isn't human anymore?" Before I could respond, we heard Kevin screaming. His voice echoed through the forest, high and terrified, coming from the direction he and David had gone. We grabbed flashlights and ran toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush. We found David first, standing motionless next to a massive oak tree. He didn't respond when we called his name, just stood there staring up into the branches with that same flat expression Sarah had worn. Kevin was 20 feet up in the same tree, caught in a fork between 2 large branches. But he was hanging wrong, his limbs bent at angles that suggested multiple broken bones. His eyes were open and tracking our movement, but he couldn't speak. Something had crushed his larynx. "Kevin!" Jennifer called up to him. "We'll get you down." But as she spoke, Kevin's mouth opened and Sarah's voice came out. "No need to come up here. The view is wonderful. You can see everything from up here. All the hungry faces in the trees, waiting for their turn." That's when I saw them. The elongated figures from the stream, dozens of them now, perched in trees all around us like enormous emaciated birds. Their pale eyes reflected our flashlight beams, and their 2 wide mouths hung open, showing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Run," Jennifer whispered. We ran, leaving Kevin hanging in the tree and David standing beneath it like a scarecrow. I don't know if they followed us. I didn't look back. Jennifer and I made it back to the campsite and immediately began gathering anything that might be used as a weapon. I had a hatchet from my camping gear, and Jennifer found a knife in Kevin's extensive collection. Not much against creatures that could hang grown men in trees like Christmas ornaments, but better than nothing. "What do they want?" I asked. "What they've always wanted," Jennifer replied. "To feed. But it's not just physical hunger. They feed on fear, on despair, on the slow dissolution of sanity that comes from being hunted by something you can't understand or fight." "How do you know all this?" "Because I've been researching them for 5 years. Every folklore collection, every anthropological study, every urban legend about this area. The Seneca weren't the first people to encounter them. This has been going on for centuries." As if summoned by our conversation, the voices started again. But this time, they weren't calling from the forest. They were coming from our campsite. Sarah's voice. "Michael, why did you leave me out here? I'm so cold." David's voice. "Jennifer, I found your brother. He wants to see you." Kevin's voice. "Help me down from this tree. Please, I can't feel my legs." But the voices were coming from inside our tents. "Don't listen," Jennifer said, gripping her knife so tightly her knuckles were white. "Whatever you do, don't look in the tents." But I could see Sarah's silhouette through the nylon wall of my tent, moving around inside as if looking for something. The shadow was wrong, too tall and thin, with arms that reached down past where knees should be. "Michael," came Sarah's voice again, muffled by the tent fabric. "I found your journal. I'm reading all your secrets, all the things you never told us." My journal was in my backpack, which was in Jennifer's tent on the other side of the camp. The thing wearing Sarah's voice laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "She never liked you, you know. None of them did. They only tolerated you because they felt sorry for you. Poor, pathetic Michael, so desperate to belong somewhere." I knew it was lying, trying to break down my defenses by attacking my deepest insecurities, but knowing that didn't make the words hurt any less. David's voice joined in from Kevin's large tent. "Remember when you had that panic attack during the Johnson audit? We all made fun of you behind your back. Jennifer started the pool betting on how long before you had a nervous breakdown." "He's lying," Jennifer said, but I could see doubt in her eyes. Kevin's voice, now coming from Jennifer's tent. "She's lying too, about her brother, about everything. She brought you here as bait. She made a deal with them. Your lives for information about what happened to her precious little brother." "That's not true," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. The voices kept talking, weaving a web of lies and half-truths designed to turn us against each other. They knew things about our lives, our relationships, our deepest fears and insecurities, personal details that should have been impossible for them to know. But as they talked, I began to notice something. The voices were too perfect, too exactly like our missing friends. Real people have verbal tics, slight variations in pitch and tone, speech patterns that develop over years. These voices were like digital recordings played back without any of the subtle imperfections that make speech human. "They're not our friends," I said suddenly. "They're mimics. They're copying the voices, but they don't really understand them." "What do you mean?" Jennifer asked. "Listen to the way Sarah is talking. She never called me Michael. She always called me Mike, and David is using words he'd never use. Kevin never said precious in his entire life." The voices stopped abruptly as if they'd been caught in their deception. That's when the real attack began. The sides of all 3 tents bulged inward as if something large was pressing against them from outside. The nylon stretched and strained but didn't tear, creating the impression of massive hands or claws trying to push through. "The fire," Jennifer said. "They don't like the fire." We fed more wood to the flames, building them higher than ever before. The bulging stopped, but we could hear movement all around us in the darkness just beyond the light. "We need more fuel," I said, looking at our dwindling pile of firewood. "The tents," Jennifer said, "and Kevin's gear, anything that will burn." We dismantled the tents and fed them to the fire piece by piece. Nylon burns fast and hot, but not for long. Kevin's expensive camping equipment bought us maybe an hour. "It's not enough," Jennifer said as the flames began to die down again. "We need a permanent solution." "Like what?" She stared into the fire, her face grim. "We need to find the source, the thing that's controlling them. In every story I've read, every legend, there's always a core entity, something that commands the others." "And how exactly do we find this thing?" "We follow the stream, back to where it starts. That's where it will be." I stared at her. "You want to go back to that place? With those things? It's the only way. If we stay here, we'll just die slowly. If we go to the source, maybe we can end this." She was right, but that didn't make the prospect any less terrifying. We gathered what supplies we could carry and left the dying fire behind. Jennifer led the way, using her knife as a crude compass. Apparently, the blade was made of real steel and could detect magnetic north even when modern instruments failed. The forest at night was a nightmare maze of grasping branches and hidden roots. Our flashlights cast wild shadows that made every tree look like a lurking creature. But worse than what we could see was what we could hear. The sound of movement keeping pace with us on all sides just beyond the reach of our lights. They were herding us, I realized, driving us toward some predetermined destination. The stream appeared ahead of us, that thick, dark flow that wasn't water, but now I could see that it wasn't flowing downhill as streams should. It was flowing upward, defying gravity, following some otherworldly logic. We followed it upstream, our feet squelching in mud that felt more like decaying flesh. The smell was overwhelming, rotting meat mixed with something acrid and chemical. The source of the stream was a pool at the base of a massive oak tree that had to be centuries old. The tree was wrong in every way possible. Its bark was smooth and pale like human skin. Its branches moved without any wind, and its roots extended into the pool like feeding tubes. And hanging from its branches like obscene fruit were dozens of cocoons, human-shaped cocoons that twitched and pulsed with internal movement. "Oh, God," Jennifer whispered. "They're still alive." Some of the cocoons were old, the material gray and brittle. Others looked fresh, the surface still wet and glistening. I could see faces pressed against the interior walls, distorted but recognizable. Sarah was there, her features barely visible through the translucent membrane. David, Kevin, and dozens of others, people who had disappeared in these woods over the years. "They're being transformed," Jennifer said, her voice hollow with horror. "Slowly changed into those things we saw." That's when I heard the voice behind us. "Jennifer." We turned to see a young man standing at the edge of the pool. He was tall and thin, with Jennifer's dark hair and brown eyes, but his skin had that same grayish, mottled appearance as the creatures we'd encountered, and his limbs were slightly too long for his body. "Tommy?" Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper. "Hello, sis." Tommy smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "I've been waiting for you to come visit." "You're dead," Jennifer said, but she was already moving toward him. "No," Tommy replied. "I'm more than I ever was when I was human. I'm part of something bigger now, something that's been here since before your ancestors learned to make fire." I grabbed Jennifer's arm, trying to stop her approach, but she shook me off. "I can show you," Tommy continued. "I can show you what it's like to never be hungry again, never be cold, never be afraid. All you have to do is step into the pool." The water, if it was water, began to glow with a sickly phosphorescence. I could see things moving beneath the surface, pale and writhing. "Jennifer, don't," I said. "That's not your brother anymore." But she was already knee-deep in the pool, wading toward Tommy with her arms outstretched. That's when I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled out my hatchet and brought it down on the nearest root extending from the ancient oak into the pool. The tree let out a sound like a scream. Not the kind of scream a human makes, but something deeper and more primal, a sound that spoke of hunger that had existed since the world was young. Black ichor sprayed from the severed root, and the entire pool began to churn violently. The cocoons hanging from the tree's branches started splitting open, spilling their occupants into the water below. "What have you done?" Tommy shrieked, his voice multiplying until it sounded like a dozen people screaming in unison. "Jennifer, get out of there," I yelled, swinging the hatchet at another root. She was fighting her way back to shore, the rising water now up to her waist. Things were surfacing in the pool, pale, formless shapes that might once have been human but had been broken down into their component parts and reassembled wrong. I kept chopping at the roots, each blow producing another inhuman shriek from the tree. The phosphorescent glow was getting brighter, and I could feel heat radiating from the pool. Tommy was changing, his human facade melting away to reveal something that was all teeth and claws and desperate hunger. He lunged at me just as Jennifer made it to shore. "The tree," she gasped. "It's the source. You have to cut it down." But my small camping hatchet wasn't going to fell a tree that size, especially not one that was fighting back. The branches were reaching for me now, their movements deliberate and predatory. That's when I remembered Kevin's gear, specifically the camp stove fuel he'd brought. The stuff was basically liquid fire. "The stove fuel," I shouted to Jennifer, "in Kevin's pack. Get it." She understood immediately, digging through the scattered remains of our camping gear while I kept swinging at the tree's roots. The ancient oak was bleeding now, that same black ichor oozing from every cut I'd made. Jennifer found 3 fuel canisters and began dousing the base of the tree. The smell of camp fuel mixed with the stench of decay, creating a cocktail of odors that made my eyes water. "Get back," she warned, pulling out a lighter. The tree went up like it had been soaked in gasoline. The flames spread unnaturally fast, racing up the trunk and into the branches where the remaining cocoons began to pop and sizzle like popcorn. The screaming was unbearable, not just from the tree but from all the creatures in the forest. Dozens of voices crying out in pain and rage as their source of power was destroyed. Tommy made one last desperate lunge at us, but his form was already dissolving. He looked at Jennifer with eyes that held a moment of clarity, of humanity. "Thank you," he whispered, and then he was gone. The pool began to drain rapidly, the unnatural water flowing away into cracks that opened in the ground. As it drained, I could see the bottom was lined with bones, hundreds of bones from dozens of victims. The fire spread to the surrounding trees, but these burned normally, like regular wood. The wrongness was leaving the forest, taking with it the supernatural cold and the oppressive silence. We ran. Not from any immediate threat, but from the growing fire and the collapse of whatever otherworldly pocket we'd been trapped in. The forest shifted around us as we moved, paths appearing where none had existed before. We found our cars where we'd left them, engines intact and ready to start. My cell phone showed full signal strength and a dozen missed calls from our office, wondering where we were on Monday morning. Monday morning. We'd been gone for 3 days, but somehow it was only Monday morning. Jennifer and I drove out of those woods in silence. We never talked about what happened, never tried to explain it to anyone else. What would be the point? Who would believe us? But I know what I saw. I know what we survived. The official report listed Sarah Rodriguez, David Jones, and Kevin Young as missing hikers whose remains were never recovered. The forest fire was blamed on an illegal campfire left unattended by person or persons unknown. Jennifer quit the company a week later and moved to Florida. I tried to keep in touch, but she never responded to my calls or emails. I think she wanted to forget, to pretend it never happened. But I can't forget. I dream about that place every night, about the faces in the cocoons and the sound of that ancient tree screaming as it burned. I wake up checking my arms and legs, making sure they're the right length, making sure I'm still human. Because I know now that there are places in this world where the normal rules don't apply, places where old hungers wait in the darkness, patient and eternal, for the next group of hikers to wander too far from the light. I've never been camping since. I never will again. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear voices calling my name from impossible directions, and I know that somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, something that was once human but isn't anymore, is still looking for me. Still hungry for what I escaped with. The thing about survival horror isn't the surviving. It's the knowledge that you never really escape. You just postpone the inevitable. And somewhere out there, in the deep woods where the old things wait, my name is still being called. The hunger never ends. It just finds new voices to speak with. My name is David Jones, and I am 31 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Hollow Ridge, Pennsylvania, deep in the heart of the Allegheny National Forest, where the ancient trees grow so thick that daylight barely penetrates even at noon. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, my college roommate Marcus Williams, and our mutual friend Sarah Rodriguez. We'd been planning it for months, ever since Sarah's divorce was finalized and she needed to get away from everything. Marcus had found this spot on some obscure hiking forum, a place called Hollow Ridge that supposedly offered incredible views and complete isolation from the modern world. No cell towers for 30 miles, he'd said with that characteristic grin of his, the one that usually preceded his worst ideas. Just us, nature, and some good old-fashioned camping. Sarah had been enthusiastic about the idea. She was going through what she called her wilderness phase, buying expensive hiking boots and a sleeping bag rated for Arctic conditions. After 18 months of a bitter divorce battle, I couldn't blame her for wanting to disappear into the woods for a while. We left Pittsburgh early Friday morning in Marcus's battered Jeep Cherokee, driving northwest through increasingly rural Pennsylvania until the highways became state routes, then county roads, then unmarked dirt tracks that seemed to lead nowhere. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and Marcus was navigating with a paper map he'd printed from some survivalist website. "Are you sure you know where we're going?" Sarah asked from the passenger seat, her voice carrying just a hint of anxiety as we bounced along a rutted logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. "Relax," Marcus said, though I noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The forum said to look for the old ranger station with the broken windows. Should be coming up any minute now. The ranger station, when we finally found it, was more ruins than building. Weather-beaten walls leaned at impossible angles, and windows stared out like dead eyes. Graffiti covered what remained of the front door, but it wasn't the usual teenage tags. These were symbols I didn't recognize. Angular, primitive shapes that seemed to writhe when I looked at them too long. "Cheerful," Sarah muttered, but she was already checking her pack, eager to start hiking. According to Marcus's printout, the trail to Hollow Ridge began behind the station and wound 4 miles through dense forest to a clearing where we could set up camp. The hike started pleasant enough. The October air was crisp, filled with the earthy smell of decomposing leaves, and the forest was alive with the subtle sounds of small animals moving through the underbrush. But as we climbed higher, something began to feel wrong. It started with the silence. At first, I thought it was just the natural quiet of deep woods, but then I realized it was more than that. There were no bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustling of small creatures in the leaves. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing sound. "Is it just me, or is it really quiet up here?" Sarah asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Marcus paused on the trail ahead of us, cocking his head to listen. "Yeah, it is weird. Maybe there's a predator around? Sometimes that makes everything go quiet." We kept hiking, but the oppressive silence followed us like a living thing. The trees seemed to press closer together, their branches intertwining overhead until only scattered fragments of sky were visible. The trail became harder to follow, sometimes disappearing entirely into carpets of fallen leaves or branching off in multiple directions with no markers to guide us. "Are we lost?" Sarah asked when we stopped at yet another unmarked fork in the path. Marcus consulted his map, frowning. "I don't think so. The trail should be straightforward. Maybe we took a wrong turn back there. But when we looked back, there was no clear trail behind us either. The forest seemed to have swallowed our route, leaving only shadowy gaps between the trees that all looked identical. "This is impossible," I said, fighting down a rising sense of panic. "We've only been hiking for 2 hours. We can't be this lost." That's when we heard it, a low, mournful sound drifting through the trees. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. It rose and fell like a lament, echoing off the tree trunks until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered. The sound came again, closer this time, and underneath it I could swear I heard something else, a rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming against bark. "We need to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice tight with tension. "Find the ridge. Set up camp before dark." We pushed forward, following what seemed like the most worn path, though even that was debatable. The tapping sound followed us, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, never quite close enough to identify but never far enough away to ignore. The mournful wailing continued too, rising and falling in patterns that almost seemed like communication. By the time we reached what Marcus insisted was Hollow Ridge, the sun was already setting behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The ridge was little more than a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, but it was flat enough for our tents and had a circle of stones that previous campers had used for a fire pit. "Finally," Sarah said, dropping her pack with obvious relief. "Let's get camp set up before it gets completely dark." We worked quickly in the fading light, setting up our 2-person tents and gathering firewood from the edge of the clearing. The sounds had stopped during our final push to the ridge, but the silence felt even more ominous than the mysterious noises. Marcus had just gotten a fire started when we heard the first scream. It came from the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight, a human scream, definitely human, but distorted somehow, as if the vocal cords producing it weren't quite the right shape. It was full of pain and terror and something else, something that made my skin crawl and my primitive brain scream warnings. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered, instinctively moving closer to the fire. "Was that a person?" The scream came again, and this time I could tell it was coming from multiple directions, not echoes, multiple sources, as if whatever was making that sound was surrounding us. Should we go help?" Sarah asked, though her voice made it clear she really didn't want to. "Help what?" Marcus snapped, his usual easy confidence nowhere to be found. That didn't sound like someone who needed help. That sounded like someone who was way past help. The screaming continued for nearly an hour, sometimes close, sometimes distant, sometimes seeming to come from directly above us in the canopy. We huddled around our fire, feeding it constantly to keep the flames high, and tried to convince ourselves that there was a rational explanation. Coyotes, maybe, or some kind of bird, but we all knew better. When the screaming finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse. We sat around the fire, jumping at every small sound, every crackle of burning wood, every whisper of wind through the branches. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah said finally. "Pack up and hike back to the car." "In the dark?" Marcus shook his head. "Through those woods, with whatever that was out there? No way. We're safer here with the fire." He was probably right, but as the night wore on, I began to question that assumption. The fire seemed to be attracting attention rather than providing protection. I kept seeing shapes moving just beyond the circle of light, tall, thin figures that stood among the trees, watching us. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Marcus, pointing toward a particularly large pine where I was sure I'd seen something tall and pale. He followed my gaze and nodded slowly. "Yeah, I see it." "See what?" Sarah demanded, looking where we were pointing. "Nothing," Marcus said quickly, "just shadows." But it wasn't nothing. As the fire burned lower despite our constant feeding, the shapes became more distinct. They were human-like but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, moving in ways that hurt to watch, and they were getting closer. Around midnight, Sarah announced she was going to her tent to try to get some sleep. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked. "I can't stay awake all night," she said. "Besides, whatever's out there, it would have attacked by now if it was going to." Marcus and I stayed by the fire, taking turns adding wood and watching the tree line. The shapes continued their slow circling, never quite stepping into the light but never disappearing entirely either. "This is fucked up," Marcus muttered. "I've been camping my whole life and I've never experienced anything like this." "Maybe it's just our imagination," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Fear and darkness playing tricks on us. Both of us having the same hallucination? I didn't have an answer for that. Around 3 in the morning, Sarah screamed. It wasn't the inhuman wailing we'd heard earlier. This was definitely Sarah, and she was terrified. Marcus and I both grabbed flashlights and ran toward her tent, but when we unzipped the door, it was empty. Her sleeping bag was there, unzipped from the inside. Her boots were still neatly placed beside her pack, but Sarah was gone. "Sarah," Marcus called into the darkness. "Sarah, where are you?" No response. We spent the next hour searching the perimeter of the clearing, calling her name and sweeping our flashlight beams through the trees. But the forest seemed to swallow our voices, and our lights penetrated only a few feet into the oppressive darkness. "We have to go find her," Marcus said when we finally stopped to catch our breath. "Go where?" I demanded. "We don't even know which direction she went. And what if whatever took her is still out there?" "So we just abandon her." Before I could answer, we heard her voice calling from the darkness. "Marcus, David, help me." The voice was definitely Sarah's, but something about it seemed off. The cadence was wrong, like someone reading from a script in a language they didn't quite understand. "Sarah," Marcus called back, "where are you?" "I'm lost," came the reply. "I got turned around. I can see your fire, but I can't find my way back." Marcus was already grabbing his flashlight, but I caught his arm. "Wait," I said. "Something's wrong." "What do you mean?" "Listen to her voice. It doesn't sound right." Marcus paused, and we both strained to hear. Sarah called out again, and this time I was certain. The voice was too flat, too emotionless for someone who was genuinely lost and frightened. "Sarah," Marcus called carefully. "What's your middle name?" A long pause. Then, "Help me. I can see your fire." The same words, in the same flat tone, as if whatever was mimicking her voice had a limited vocabulary. "That's not Sarah," I whispered. As if in response to my words, the voice began calling from multiple directions at once. Always the same phrases. "Help me. I'm lost. I can see your fire." But now there were dozens of voices, all with Sarah's timbre but lacking any trace of her personality. We retreated to our fire, which had burned dangerously low while we were searching. As we fed it fresh wood, the flames revealed something that made my blood freeze. Sarah was standing at the edge of the clearing. She looked exactly like herself. Same clothes, same hair, same face, but she was standing perfectly still, arms at her sides, staring at us with an expression of complete emptiness. Her eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Sarah?" Marcus called tentatively. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. "Sarah, are you okay?" Very slowly, she began to smile. But it wasn't Sarah's smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth, and it never reached her eyes. "I'm fine," she said in that same flat tone. "Come here." "No," I said, grabbing Marcus's arm as he started to step toward her. "That's not her." The thing wearing Sarah's face tilted its head like a curious bird. "Come here," it repeated. When we didn't move, it began walking toward us. Its gait was wrong. Too smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. As it drew closer, I could see that its eyes were completely black, reflecting the firelight like pools of oil. "Come here," it said again, and this time its voice was layered, as if multiple people were speaking the words simultaneously. Marcus raised his flashlight and shone it directly at the thing's face. In the harsh white light, its features seemed to shift and blur, as if we were looking at it through water. The smile never wavered. "What do you want?" Marcus demanded. The thing stopped just outside the circle of firelight. "Come here," it said in Sarah's voice. Then, in a voice that was deeper, more guttural, "Come to us." "Where's Sarah?" I shouted. "What did you do with her?" The thing's head tilted the other way. When it spoke again, it was in Sarah's voice, but the words were wrong. "David, Marcus, I'm so cold. Please help me. I can't find my way home." "Prove you're Sarah," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "Tell us something only Sarah would know." The thing stood silent for a long moment, its black eyes fixed on us. Then it began to speak in a voice that was Sarah's, but somehow came from everywhere at once. "I remember when you kissed me at Jenny's party, Marcus. I remember how you told me you loved me, David. I remember all your secrets, all your fears. I know how you cried when your father died, Marcus. I know how you wake up screaming from nightmares about the car accident, David." It was using our memories, but twisting them. Sarah had never kissed Marcus at any party. I'd never told her about my nightmares. But somehow, this thing knew details about our lives that we'd never shared with anyone. "Come here," it said again, and began moving toward us once more. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it up like a weapon. The thing stopped, its empty eyes fixed on the flames. "It doesn't like fire," I whispered to Marcus. The thing that looked like Sarah began to laugh, a sound like glass breaking, harsh and wrong. As it laughed, its face began to change. The features remained Sarah's, but they started to elongate, the mouth stretching too wide, the eyes sinking deeper into the skull. "Fire burns," it said in a voice that was no longer even pretending to be human, "but cold is eternal." The temperature around us began to drop rapidly. Our breath started coming out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the nearby trees. The fire, which had been burning strongly moments before, began to sputter and dim. "Feed the fire!" I shouted to Marcus, but when he threw more wood on, the flames barely responded. It was as if the heat was being sucked away faster than we could produce it. The thing wearing Sarah's face had stopped laughing and was now approaching again, its features continuing to distort. Its limbs were becoming too long, its fingers stretching into claw-like appendages. "This is our place," it said in voices that seemed to come from the forest itself. "You do not belong here, but we will make you belong. We will make you stay." I could see other shapes emerging from the tree line now, tall, impossible figures that moved like broken marionettes. They all had human faces, but wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to recreate human features from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. "Run," I whispered to Marcus. "Where?" It was a good question. We were surrounded and we had no idea which direction would lead us back to the car. But staying meant facing whatever these things planned to do to us. The Sarah thing was close enough now that I could smell it. A rotten, fetid odor like decomposing leaves and stagnant water. When it spoke again, its voice was a chorus of whispers. She fought so hard, screamed so prettily, but in the end, she came to us willingly. They always do. That's when I saw it. Hanging from one of the Sarah thing's elongated fingers was a strip of fabric. Sarah's jacket, torn and bloody. The rage that filled me was pure and primal. Without thinking, I swung the burning branch at the thing's face. It connected with a sound like sizzling meat, and the creature shrieked, not in Sarah's voice anymore, but in something that might have been the sound wind makes through dead trees. "Run!" I shouted, and Marcus and I bolted into the forest. We crashed through the underbrush, our flashlight beams dancing wildly as we tried to navigate between the trees. Behind us, I could hear sounds of pursuit. Not footsteps, but something more like rustling, as if the forest itself was moving to follow us. "The trail!" Marcus gasped. "We need to find the trail!" But in the darkness, every direction looked the same. The trees seemed to shift and move when we weren't looking directly at them, and our flashlights revealed paths that hadn't been there moments before. We ran for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time seemed elastic in the darkness, stretching and contracting without pattern. Every few minutes we would hear Sarah's voice calling to us from the darkness. "David, Marcus, why did you leave me? I'm hurt. Please come back." But we knew better now. Whatever was using her voice was hunting us, trying to lure us back into its trap. Eventually, exhaustion forced us to stop. We huddled together behind a fallen log, trying to catch our breath and orient ourselves. Our flashlights were starting to dim, and we had no idea which direction we'd been running. "We're completely lost," Marcus whispered. "Maybe when the sun comes up, we can get our bearings," I said, though the thought of spending hours in these woods filled me with dread. That's when we heard it, an engine. It was distant, but unmistakable, the sound of a vehicle moving along a road. We looked at each other with sudden hope. "The logging road," Marcus said. "We must be close to where we parked." We followed the sound, stumbling through the darkness toward what we hoped was salvation. The engine noise grew louder, and eventually we saw lights through the trees, the headlights of a truck moving slowly along the dirt road. We burst out of the forest just as the truck was passing our position. I had never been so happy to see another human being in my life. The truck stopped and an older man got out, a local, judging by his flannel shirt and worn jeans. He looked us over with the kind of practiced eye that suggested he'd seen lost hikers before. "You boys okay?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "We need to get out of here," I said. Something happened to our friend." The man's expression grew serious. "Where?" "Up at Hollow Ridge. We were camping and something took her." The man was quiet for a long moment, studying our faces in the truck's headlights. Finally, he nodded toward his vehicle. "Get in. I'll take you to the ranger station. They'll know what to do." As we climbed into the truck, I looked back at the forest. The trees seemed to be moving in the darkness, and I could swear I saw pale figures standing among them, watching us leave. "Does this happen often?" Marcus asked the driver as we pulled away. The old man was quiet for so long that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, just as we reached the main road, he spoke. "Hollow Ridge has been trouble for as long as anyone can remember. Used to be a Seneca burial ground, before the logging companies moved in. Some places, the dead don't rest easy." "What about the things we saw? The creatures?" Another long pause. "Every few years, someone goes missing up there. Usually hikers or campers who don't know the stories. Sometimes they find the bodies. Sometimes they don't." "And the authorities know about this?" The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Son, the authorities around here know better than to go up to Hollow Ridge after dark. They'll file a report, but they won't mount a search until daylight. And by then." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. At the ranger station, we gave our statements to a tired-looking deputy who took notes but didn't seem particularly surprised by our story. He promised they would organize a search party at first light, but his tone suggested he didn't expect to find Sarah alive. Marcus and I drove back to Pittsburgh in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find logical explanations for what we'd experienced. Hallucinations brought on by stress and fear, perhaps. Or elaborate pranks by locals who wanted to keep outsiders away from their hunting grounds. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what had worn Sarah's face and spoken with her voice. And I knew that somewhere in those dark woods, something unnatural had claimed another victim. The official search lasted 3 days and found no trace of Sarah Rodriguez. The case was eventually filed as a missing person, with the assumption that she had gotten lost in the woods and succumbed to exposure or injury. Her body was never found. Marcus and I never spoke about what really happened that night. How could we? Who would believe us? But sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I hear Sarah's voice calling to me. Not the flat, emotionless mimicry of the thing that took her, but her real voice, full of pain and fear. "David," it whispers, Why did you leave me? Why didn't you save me?" And I know that somewhere in the darkness of Hollow Ridge, Sarah Rodriguez is still screaming, still fighting against things that should not exist in any sane world, still waiting for someone to come back for her. But I also know that anyone who tries will join her in that endless, frozen hell. The rational part of my mind tells me to let the dead rest. But the part of me that loved Sarah as a friend, that promised to protect her on this trip, that part whispers that I should go back, that I should face whatever lurks in those woods and try to bring her home. It's been 6 months since that night, and I still wake up screaming. I've moved 3 times, changed my phone number twice, and started sleeping with all the lights on. But I can't escape the knowledge that somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, ancient things are stirring. Things that hunger for human warmth and human memories, things that wear the faces of our loved ones while they feed on our terror. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I think about driving back to Hollow Ridge, not to camp or hike, but to face what took Sarah and either rescue her or join her. Because the worst part isn't wondering what happened to her. The worst part is knowing that whatever those things did to her, she's probably still alive to experience it. And that knowledge is slowly driving me insane.